The Black Hills encounter. Jeremiah Black Elk had been tracking the wounded elk for 3 hours when the forest went silent. Not the gradual quiet that comes with dusk, but the sudden, complete absence of sound that makes a hunter's spine crawl. He stopped his Honda Foreman ATV 20 yards from where the blood trail disappeared into a thicket of serviceberry bushes, the engine's rumble echoing off the limestone cliffs that surrounded this forgotten valley in the Black Hills. The silence pressed against his eardrums like a physical weight. No birds, no squirrels. Even the wind had stopped moving through the ponderosa pines that towered above him, their branches frozen as if the entire forest held its breath. Jeremiah had hunted these hills for 37 years, since his grandfather first took him out with a .22 when he was 8 years old, and he'd never experienced anything like this. He killed the engine and sat listening, his weathered hands still gripping the handlebars. The ATV's metal frame ticked as it cooled, unnaturally loud in the suffocating quiet. He'd been following the elk since dawn, a massive bull he'd wounded with a poorly placed shot just after sunrise. The animal had taken the bullet in the shoulder, not fatal, but enough to send it crashing deeper into the wilderness, leaving a trail of dark blood spatters on the yellowing autumn grass. The guilt gnawed at him. Grandfather always said a clean kill was a prayer, a messy one was a sin. Jeremiah had rushed the shot, eager to get back to his truck before the afternoon thunderstorms rolled in from the west. Now he was miles from any road, following a wounded animal into terrain he barely recognized, and the sky above the canyon was already darkening with the promise of rain. Something was wrong here. The forest felt empty, but not naturally empty. It felt abandoned, as if every living thing had fled from some invisible threat. Jeremiah had spent enough time in the wilderness to trust his instincts, and right now every instinct screamed at him to turn around, fire up the ATV, and get the hell out of this valley. But the elk was still out there, suffering. He couldn't leave it. He climbed off the ATV and checked his rifle, a well-maintained Remington 730-006 that had belonged to his father. 5 rounds left in the magazine, 1 in the chamber. More than enough for a wounded elk if he could get close enough for a clean shot. He pulled his hunting pack from the ATV's rear rack, checking his supplies: half a bottle of water, 2 energy bars, a small first aid kit, emergency blanket, compass, and his cell phone. The phone showed 1 bar of signal, barely enough for a text message, but probably not enough for a call. The blood trail continued past the serviceberry thicket, droplets already turning brown on the fallen leaves. The elk was losing blood steadily, but not heavily. It could stay on its feet for hours, maybe days if the wound didn't fester. Jeremiah had to find it before dark, before the rain washed away the trail. He shouldered the rifle and began following the blood drops deeper into the thicket. The vegetation grew denser as he moved away from the ATV, serviceberry bushes giving way to chokecherry and wild plum, their branches heavy with fruit that hung untouched despite being prime foraging season. Even the bears weren't here. That should have been his first real warning. The trail led him down into a narrow ravine where a seasonal creek had carved a channel through the limestone. The creek was dry now, nothing but smooth stones and the occasional pool of stagnant water reflecting the overcast sky. The blood trail followed the creek bed for 100 yards before turning uphill toward a stand of aspen trees whose leaves should have been rustling in the afternoon breeze but hung motionless as if painted against the sky. Jeremiah paused at the edge of the aspen grove, studying the ground. The elk's tracks were clear in the soft earth, 4 deep hoof prints showing the animal's distress, the way it favored its right front leg. But there were other marks in the mud, impressions he couldn't immediately identify. They looked almost like footprints, but far too large to be human. At least 18 inches long and 8 inches wide, with what appeared to be toe marks at the front. Bear, maybe. A very large bear, except the shape was wrong. too narrow and elongated, and the stride length was enormous, at least 6 feet between prints. Jeremiah had tracked plenty of black bears over the years, and even the biggest ones didn't leave prints like these. He knelt beside one of the clearest impressions, using his hunting knife to clear away loose leaves. The print was pressed deep into the mud, deeper than his own boot prints, despite the softer soles. Whatever made this track was heavy, probably over 400 pounds. The toe marks were clearly defined, 5 of them, and at the front of each toe was a small depression that might have been a claw mark. But claws didn't explain the odd ridges and lines across the pad area, impressions that looked almost like skin texture. Jeremiah had seen plenty of bear pads, and they were smooth. These looked like they'd been made by something with ridged, wrinkled skin on the soles of its feet. He stood up, scanning the aspen grove with new wariness. The trees grew thick here, their white trunks like prison bars in the failing light. Visibility was maybe 20 yards in any direction, plenty of concealment for a large predator. If there was a bear in these trees, wounded and territorial, following the same blood trail he was following. The thought made him check his rifle again, ensuring the safety was off, and a round was chambered. He'd never had to shoot a bear in self-defense, but he'd heard enough stories from other hunters to know that black bears could be unpredictable when they smelled blood. A wounded elk would attract scavengers, and a surprise scavenger could turn aggressive fast. The blood trail continued through the aspens, the droplets smaller now, but still visible on the pale tree trunks where the elk had brushed against them. The elk was weakening, moving more slowly. If Jeremiah could maintain his pace, he might catch up to it before full dark. But those strange footprints troubled him. They appeared alongside the elk trail sporadically, sometimes overlapping the hoofprints, as if whatever made them had been following the same path. The stride pattern was wrong for any animal he knew, too regular, too purposeful. Bears didn't walk in straight lines like that. They ambled, wandered, followed their noses. These prints showed something moving with direction and intent. He was still puzzling over the tracks when he heard the first sound that didn't belong. It came from somewhere ahead, deeper in the aspen grove, a low, rumbling vocalization that started almost below the threshold of human hearing and rose to become a growl, then something that might have been a moan or a sigh. It lasted maybe 5 seconds, then faded into the unnatural silence. Jeremiah froze, every muscle tense. The sound hadn't come from any animal he recognized, not a bear, which would have been a sharper growl or a huffing breath, not an elk, which would have been a bugle or a bark. This was something else entirely, something that seemed to combine the deep chest tones of a large predator with an almost human quality that made the hair on his arms stand up. He waited, listening, but the sound didn't repeat. After 2 full minutes of silence, he began moving again, but now he held the rifle ready, safety off, finger resting alongside the trigger guard. Each step was careful, deliberate, placing his boots on solid ground to minimize noise. The blood trail led him to the far edge of the aspen grove, where the trees gave way to a small meadow, maybe 50 yards across. The grass was tall here, knee-high, and golden brown with the approaching autumn. On the far side of the meadow, dark pine forest climbed toward the canyon rim. Jeremiah could see storm clouds gathering beyond the ridge, their undersides heavy with rain. The elk had crossed the meadow, its blood trail visible as dark spots on the grass stems. But something else had crossed here too. The grass was trampled in a path maybe 3 feet wide, the stems broken and flattened by something heavy moving through them. The path paralleled the elk trail for most of the way across the meadow, then diverged toward the tree line on the right. Jeremiah studied the trampled grass, trying to read the story it told. The elk had moved straight across the meadow, its gait becoming more labored based on the spacing of the blood drops. But whatever had made the parallel path had moved differently, with a longer stride and more weight. Some of the grass stems were pressed so deep into the earth they'd left furrows in the soil beneath. He was halfway across the meadow when the smell hit him. It came with a shift in the barely perceptible breeze, a wave of stench so powerful and foreign that his stomach clenched and his eyes watered. The smell was complex, layered. Wet fur that had been soaked and dried repeatedly, the sweet, sick smell of rot. Something musky and animal that reminded him of the bear exhibit at the zoo, and underneath it all, something else. Something that made his primitive brain scream warnings about predators and death and things that hunt in the dark. The smell was so strong he could taste it, a thick coating in his mouth that made him want to spit. He'd smelled plenty of dead animals over the years, had field-dressed deer and elk in all states of decay, but this was different. This was the smell of something alive, something that carried death with it wherever it went. He fought the urge to gag and kept moving, breathing through his mouth to minimize the assault on his nose. The smell seemed to be coming from the tree line where the trampled grass path disappeared, somewhere in the dark shadows between the pine trunks. Whatever had made that path, whatever had left those impossible footprints, it was close. The rational part of his mind catalogued possibilities. A dead bear, maybe, something that had been feeding on carrion, or a sick animal, an elk or deer with some kind of infection that produced that terrible smell. But the rational part of his mind was losing the argument with the older, deeper part that had kept his ancestors alive for thousands of years before guns and trucks and cell phones. That part was screaming at him to run. He reached the far side of the meadow and paused at the edge of the pine forest, studying the shadows between the trees. The canopy was thick here, blocking most of the remaining daylight. Visibility dropped to maybe 10 yards, and the thick tree trunks created countless blind spots where something large could hide. The smell was stronger here, so thick he could almost see it, hanging in the air like a toxic fog. The elk's blood trail continued into the trees, but the droplets were smaller now, barely visible on the pine needles that carpeted the forest floor. The animal was close to collapse. Jeremiah could probably track it in the dark if he had to, but the thought of being in these woods after sunset made his skin crawl. He checked his watch. 4:47 p.m. Sunset wouldn't be until after 6, but full dark would come fast. Once the sun dropped behind the canyon rim, he had maybe an hour and a half of usable light, less if the storm clouds continued building. The smart thing would be to turn back now, return to his ATV, and come back in the morning with more supplies, and maybe another hunter for backup. But the elk was suffering, and every minute he delayed was another minute of pain for an animal that didn't deserve to die slowly because of his mistake. He owed it a clean death. He entered the forest, following the blood trail deeper into the shadows. The pine needles muffled his footsteps, but they also made it impossible to see tracks. He had to rely on the blood spots and broken twigs to follow the elk's path. The smell followed him, sometimes stronger, sometimes fainter, as if its source was moving parallel to his course. 20 yards into the forest, he found the first sign that something was actively wrong. A pine tree, at least 80 years old and 3 feet in diameter, had been damaged. The bark was scraped away in long vertical gouges that started about 6 feet off the ground and extended up to at least 9 feet. The gouges were deep, cutting through the bark and into the wood beneath, and they were fresh. Sap was still oozing from the wounds. Jeremiah examined the damage, running his fingers along the deepest gouges. The marks were too high and too deep to have been made by a bear. Even a large black bear standing on its hind legs couldn't reach 9 feet, and the claw marks would have been different, shorter and more curved. These gouges were made by something with longer claws and much more strength. More troubling, the pattern was wrong. The gouges were evenly spaced, 5 parallel lines that looked almost deliberate. A bear marking territory would have made irregular scratches, following the natural curve of its claws as it swatted at the tree. These looked like something had gripped the tree with five-fingered hands and dragged them downward with tremendous force. He was still studying the claw marks when he heard branches breaking somewhere ahead. The sound was too heavy, too deliberate to be the wounded elk. Something large was moving through the trees, pushing through underbrush that rustled and snapped under its weight. The sound came from the direction of the blood trail, maybe 50 yards ahead, but the thick forest made it impossible to pinpoint the exact location. Jeremiah raised his rifle, peering through the scope in the direction of the noise. The magnification helped cut through the shadows, but all he could see were tree trunks and undergrowth. The movement had stopped, but he could feel something watching him. It was a sensation he'd experienced while hunting, the weight of unseen eyes. But this was different, heavier, more intelligent. He waited, hardly breathing, but whatever was out there had gone still. After 5 minutes of silence, he lowered the rifle and continued following the blood trail. But now every shadow seemed to hide a threat. Every rustling branch might signal an approaching predator. The blood trail led him deeper into the pine forest, winding between massive tree trunks and over fallen logs thick with moss. The elk was moving more erratically now, the blood drops showing where it had stumbled, where it had paused to rest against trees. The animal was close to collapse, but it was also moving into terrain that would make recovery difficult. If the elk died in this dense forest, he might never find the body. As he followed the trail, Jeremiah became aware that the strange smell was getting stronger. Not just stronger, more localized. Instead of the general stench that had filled the meadow, he was now detecting specific waves of odor that seemed to come from particular directions. As if the source was moving, staying just out of sight, but close enough that the wind carried its scent. He paused frequently to listen, but heard nothing beyond the normal sounds of wind in the pine branches. Yet he couldn't shake the feeling that he was being followed, hunted. The sensation grew stronger with each step, until he found himself checking over his shoulder every few yards. The blood trail led him to a small clearing where several large trees had fallen, creating a natural opening in the canopy. Late afternoon sunlight filtered through the gap, creating the first bright spot he'd seen since entering the forest. The wounded elk had paused here. There were several blood spatters on the fallen logs, and the ground was churned with hoofprints. But there were other prints too, the same large, elongated footprints he'd seen earlier, but these were clearer, pressed into soft earth between the fallen logs. Jeremiah knelt beside the clearest print, studying its details. The impression was at least 18 inches long and showed clear toe marks, 5 of them, with what looked like claw indentations at the tips. But the proportions were all wrong for any animal he knew. The print was too narrow for a bear, too large for a human, and the toe arrangement was wrong for any hoofed animal. It looked almost like a human footprint scaled up to impossible size, but with claws. And the depth of the impression suggested something incredibly heavy, far heavier than any black bear. As he studied the track, a drop of something warm and thick splashed onto his hand. Jeremiah looked up, following the trajectory of the drop. Above him, in the branches of a large pine that overhung the clearing, something dark was moving. Not the random movement of wind-stirred branches, but deliberate, controlled motion. Something large shifting its weight from branch to branch, trying to stay hidden in the shadows. He raised the rifle slowly, using the scope to peer into the tangle of branches above. The magnification revealed patches of dark fur, a glimpse of what might have been a massive shoulder, but nothing clear enough to identify. Whatever was up there was at least 8 feet off the ground, moving through branches that would barely support a human's weight. Another drop splashed beside his boot. Not water, this was thicker, darker. When he looked closer, he realized it was saliva. Something was drooling on him from the trees above. The thought sent a spike of primitive terror through his nervous system. He scrambled backward, rifle trained on the branches, but whatever was up there had gone still again. He waited, muscles tense, finger on the trigger, but saw no further movement. After what felt like hours, but was probably only minutes, he backed away from the clearing, keeping the rifle pointed upward until he was well clear of the tree line. His heart was hammering against his ribs, and sweat ran down his face despite the cool afternoon air. Every rational part of his mind was screaming at him to forget the elk, forget his pride, and get the hell out of these woods. But he was still a mile from his ATV, maybe more. The blood trail he'd been following had taken him through a maze of ravines and thickets, and he wasn't entirely sure he could find his way back in the growing darkness. The smart thing to do was to finish tracking the elk, put it out of its misery, and then follow his own trail back to the ATV. The blood trail continued beyond the clearing, leading downhill toward what looked like another creek bed. The drops were larger now and more frequent. The elk was weakening fast. If he could just stay on the trail for another half hour, he might catch up to it before it found some impenetrable thicket to die in. He followed the blood drops down the slope, moving as quietly as possible. The feeling of being watched had intensified, and now he was sure he could hear something moving parallel to his course. Not the random sounds of small animals, but deliberate footsteps, heavy and purposeful, staying just outside his vision. The elk trail led him to a narrow creek that flowed through a steep-sided gully. The water was only a few inches deep, running clear over a bed of smooth stones. The banks were soft earth mixed with clay, perfect for reading tracks, and there were plenty of tracks to read. The elk had crossed the creek and continued up the far bank, its hoofprints clear in the mud, but the creek bed also showed the large, impossible footprints, and these were the clearest he'd seen yet. The creature, whatever it was, had stepped directly into the creek, leaving perfect impressions in the clay bottom. Jeremiah waded into the creek, studying the prints. They were definitely made by feet, not paws or hooves. 5 toes, clearly defined, with what looked like claws or thick nails at the tips. The heel was broad and flat, like a human's, but the toes were longer and thicker than any human foot. The prints were so large and deep that water was seeping into them from the creek bottom. But what made his blood run cold was the spacing. The stride length was enormous, at least 6 feet between prints. Whatever made these tracks was not only huge, but it moved with a gait unlike any animal he'd ever seen. The stride was too regular for a 4-legged animal, too long for any 2-legged animal he knew. He was studying the tracks when he heard the sound again. This time it came from much closer, maybe 20 yards upstream. The same low, rumbling vocalization he'd heard earlier, but louder and more defined. It started as a growl, deep and resonant, then rose in pitch to become something almost like a howl, but with an odd warbling quality that made it sound almost human. The sound raised every hair on his body. It wasn't pain or fear, it was communication. Something was calling to something else, and he was caught between them. Jeremiah splashed out of the creek and up the far bank, following the elk's blood trail at a faster pace. The wounded animal couldn't be far ahead, and he needed to find it quickly. Being caught in these woods after dark, with whatever was making those sounds, was not an option. The trail led uphill through dense underbrush, past deadfall logs and rocky outcroppings that slowed his progress. The elk was struggling now. The blood trail showed where it had fallen, gotten back up, fallen again. It was leaving a steady stream of blood on the vegetation, much more than the scattered drops he'd been following earlier. As he climbed, the feeling of being followed intensified. He could hear something moving through the brush behind him, not trying very hard to be quiet. Heavy footsteps that snapped twigs and rustled through dry leaves. When he stopped, the sounds stopped. When he moved, they resumed. He was being herded. The realization hit him like a physical blow. Whatever was back there wasn't just following him, it was driving him in a specific direction, away from the creek, away from easy escape routes, up toward the canyon rim where the terrain would limit his options. It was displaying hunting behavior. the kind of sophisticated strategy he'd seen wolves use to separate prey from the herd. But what kind of predator hunted humans with that level of planning? The blood trail led him to a rocky outcropping where the elk had finally collapsed. The animal lay on its side among the boulders, flanks heaving, dark eyes glazed with pain and exhaustion. It was a magnificent bull, probably 1,200 pounds, with a rack that would have made any hunter proud. But right now, all Jeremiah felt was relief that his long tracking job was nearly over. He approached carefully, rifle ready. Wounded animals could be unpredictable, and an elk this size could kill a man with a single kick, but this bull was too weak to fight. It barely lifted its head as Jeremiah knelt beside it, studying the bullet wound. The shot had hit low and back, probably damaging the liver, a slow, painful death that could take hours or days without intervention. Jeremiah placed the rifle muzzle behind the elk's ear, aimed at the brainstem, and squeezed the trigger. The gunshot echoed off the canyon walls, abnormally loud in the stillness. The elk's body relaxed immediately, the pain finally over. Jeremiah said a quiet prayer of thanks to the animal's spirit, as his grandfather had taught him, then began the process of field dressing. He was opening his pack to get his skinning knife when he heard an answering call from the forest below. The sound was identical to the one he'd heard earlier, but louder and closer. Much closer. And as the echoes of his gunshot faded, he heard a second call from a different direction, then a third. 3 distinct voices, all responding to the sound of his rifle. They were communicating, coordinating. Jeremiah abandoned the elk and grabbed his rifle, scanning the shadows between the rocks. The light was fading fast now, the sun hidden behind the canyon rim, and the forest below was already deep in shadow. Storm clouds had moved in while he was tracking, and the air had the heavy electric feel that comes before a thunderstorm. The calls came again, closer now. One from downhill, where he'd climbed up. One from the east, cutting off his most direct route back to the ATV. One from the west, blocking the creek crossing he'd used earlier. They were surrounding him. He climbed higher on the rocky outcropping, trying to get a better view of the terrain. From the top of the largest boulder, he could see across the canopy of the forest he'd just climbed through. The trees stretched away in all directions, broken by meadows and creek beds, all of it looking exactly the same in the failing light. He tried to orient himself, to identify landmarks that would help him navigate back to his ATV, but everything looked different from this angle. Movement in the trees below caught his eye. Something large was moving through the forest, pushing through brush that barely rustled under its passage. He could see the motion of disturbed branches marking its path, but couldn't make out the creature itself. It was moving parallel to the base of the rocky outcropping, maybe 50 yards out, in the direction of his planned return route. Then he saw another one. This one was coming from the east, moving with the same deliberate pace, staying just inside the tree line where the shadows would hide it, and a third, circling around from the west. All of them were converging on his position, but slowly, methodically, as if they had all the time in the world. The realization that he was trapped hit him like cold water. 3 large predators, working together, had positioned themselves to cut off his escape routes, and they'd done it in response to his gunshot, as if the sound had been a signal they'd been waiting for. Jeremiah pulled out his cell phone, hoping against logic that he might have signaled this high up. The screen showed no bars, no connection to the outside world. Even if he'd had signal, who would he call? The sheriff's department? Park rangers? How would he explain that he was trapped on a mountain by 3 unknown creatures that were hunting him like a pack of wolves? The first drops of rain began to fall, heavy and cold. Within minutes, it would become a downpour that would wash away his tracks, eliminate his scent trail, and reduce visibility to almost nothing. In the rain, in the dark, his chances of finding his way back to the ATV would drop to nearly 0. He climbed down from the boulder and began moving uphill, away from the circling creatures, toward the canyon rim. If he could reach the top of the ridge, he might be able to get his bearings, maybe find a cell signal, or at least a defensible position where he could wait out the night. The alternative, trying to fight his way through 3 large predators in the dark, was not an option. The climb was steep and treacherous, made worse by the loose rock and the gathering darkness. Rain was falling steadily now, making the stones slippery and washing mud into his eyes. He used his rifle as a walking stick, helping him maintain balance as he scrambled up the rocky slope. Behind him, he could hear them following. Not rushing, not charging, but maintaining a steady pace that suggested they knew exactly where he was going. Occasionally, he caught glimpses of movement in his peripheral vision, dark shapes flowing through the rocks like liquid shadow. The climb took almost an hour, and by the time he reached the ridgeline, full darkness had fallen. The storm was directly overhead now, with lightning flickering in the clouds and thunder rolling across the canyon. Rain fell in sheets, soaking through his jacket and turning the rocky ground into a treacherous maze of slippery surfaces. From the ridge, he could see lights in the distance, the glow of a small town maybe 10 miles away. His truck was parked at a trailhead on the other side of that town, at least 15 miles away over rough terrain. Even in daylight, with good equipment and a clear trail, it would be a difficult hike. In the dark, in the rain, it was impossible. He found a shallow overhang among the rocks, just deep enough to provide some shelter from the rain. It wasn't much, but it would have to do. He settled in with his back against the stone, rifle across his knees, and tried to plan his next move. The smart thing would be to wait for dawn. In daylight, with the storm past, he could navigate by landmarks and make his way back to his ATV. It meant spending the night on the mountain, but he had emergency supplies in his pack, and the overhang would keep him dry enough to avoid hypothermia. But he wasn't alone on this mountain. Those 3 creatures, whatever they were still down there, and they'd shown no sign of giving up the hunt. If they could navigate in the dark better than he could, if they knew this terrain better than he did, they might be waiting for him to come down from the ridge. As if summoned by his thoughts, he heard one of them calling from the forest below. The sound was different now, sharper and more urgent, as if they were frustrated by his escape to higher ground. A second voice answered from a different direction, then a third. They were still down there, still coordinating, still hunting. Jeremiah checked his rifle, counting his remaining ammunition. 4 rounds in the magazine, 1 in the chamber, 5 shots, assuming his rifle would fire reliably in the wet conditions. Against 3 large predators that seemed to be working together, 5 shots might not be enough. He pulled out his emergency supplies, taking inventory. Half a bottle of water, 2 energy bars, a small first aid kit, an emergency blanket and a lighter. Enough to survive the night if he could stay dry and warm, but not much more than that. No flashlight. He'd been planning to be back at his truck before dark, and the rifle scope had enough light-gathering power for dawn and dusk hunting. The emergency blanket was one of those space-age survival items, a thin sheet of reflective material that was supposed to retain body heat. He wrapped it around his shoulders, trying to trap what warmth he could. The rain was getting heavier, and the temperature was dropping fast. Lightning flashed across the canyon, and in that brief moment of illumination, he saw something that made his heart stop. On the ridge across from him, maybe 200 yards away, a dark shape stood silhouetted against the sky. It was enormous, at least 8 feet tall, with massive shoulders and arms that hung past its knees. It stood perfectly still, facing in his direction, as if it had been watching him all along. The lightning faded, and the shape disappeared back into darkness. But the image was burned into his retinas, humanoid but impossibly large, with proportions that belonged to no animal he'd ever seen. It had stood upright on 2 legs, with a posture that suggested intelligence and purpose. Thunder crashed overhead, shaking the rocks around him. When the echoes faded, he heard something that made his blood freeze. Footsteps. Heavy, deliberate footsteps coming up the rocky slope toward his position. Something was climbing toward him, using the storm as cover to mask the sound of its approach. Jeremiah raised his rifle, peering through the scope into the darkness below. The scope's light-gathering ability helped, but not much. All he could see were wet rocks and streaming water, shadows that might have been boulders or might have been something else. The footsteps stopped, maybe 50 yards downhill from his position. Whatever was down there had gone still, but he could feel it watching him, waiting. The sensation of being observed was so strong it was almost physical, a weight pressing against his consciousness. Minutes passed. The rain continued to fall and lightning continued to flicker in the clouds, but nothing moved on the slope below. Jeremiah's hands began to cramp from gripping the rifle so tightly, and his eyes watered from staring into the darkness. But he didn't dare move, didn't dare make a sound that might give away his exact position. Then he heard something that almost made him cry out in terror. A voice, human-sounding but impossibly deep, speaking in words he couldn't understand. The voice came from directly below him, close enough that he should have been able to see the speaker, but there was nothing there, just rocks and rain and darkness. The voice spoke again, a series of low, rumbling syllables that might have been a language or might have been something else entirely. Other voices answered from different directions, the same deep, inhuman tone, but clearly distinct speakers. They were communicating in something that resembled speech, coordinating their movements with a level of intelligence that no animal should possess. Jeremiah's rational mind tried to process what he was hearing. Bears didn't speak. Wolves didn't speak. Mountain lions didn't speak. No animal he knew of had the vocal apparatus to produce sounds like these, sounds that so clearly resembled human language, but were pitched far too low for any human throat. The voices fell silent, and the footsteps resumed. But now they were coming from multiple directions, converging on his position from different angles. They'd found him, pinpointed his location through some sense he couldn't understand, and now they were closing in. He aimed the rifle downhill, tracking the sound of the nearest footsteps. Through the scope, he caught a glimpse of something moving between the rocks, something dark and massive, flowing upward through the stone maze with impossible grace for something so large. A lightning flash illuminated the slope for a split second, and he saw it clearly. The creature was 8 feet tall and covered in dark, matted fur. It moved on 2 legs with a gait that was almost human but wrong in subtle ways. The stride too long, the arms swinging too freely, the head held too far forward. Its face was a nightmare mixture of human and ape features, a prominent brow ridge, deep-set eyes that reflected the lightning like mirrors, a flat nose, and a mouth full of teeth that gleamed white in the brief illumination. But it was the intelligence in those eyes that froze his blood. This wasn't an animal acting on instinct. This was something that could think, plan, and coordinate with others of its kind. Something that had been hunting him with the methodical patience of a skilled predator. The lightning faded and darkness returned, but the creature was still there, still climbing toward him. And there were others. He could hear them moving through the rocks on either side, surrounding his position. Jeremiah forced himself to breathe slowly, to think clearly despite the terror that threatened to overwhelm his rational mind. He had 5 shots, 3 creatures. If his first shot didn't kill one of them, if the others rushed him before he could work the bolt and chamber another round, he was dead. The footsteps stopped again, maybe 20 yards below his position, close enough that he could hear heavy breathing over the sound of the rain. The creature was studying his shelter, trying to determine the best approach. Then it began to climb again, and this time there was no subtlety to its movement. It was coming straight up the slope, directly toward his overhang. The hunt was over. Time for the kill. Jeremiah centered the crosshairs on the sound of the approaching footsteps and took up the slack in the trigger. At this range, in these conditions, he would have to wait until the creature was close enough to ensure a hit. close enough that if his shot didn't drop it immediately, it would be on top of him before he could chamber another round. The breathing grew louder, heavy, rhythmic, like a bellows pumping air. The creature was just below his position now, probably crouched among the rocks, gathering itself for the final assault. Lightning flashed again, and for one terrifying moment, Jeremiah found himself looking directly into the creature's eyes. It was less than 10 feet away, crouched on a ledge just below his overhang. The lightning revealed every detail of its impossible anatomy: massive shoulders corded with muscle, arms that were longer and thicker than any human's, hands that ended in claws capable of tearing through flesh and bone. Its face was a mask of intelligence and predatory focus, studying him with the calculating gaze of something that had killed before and would kill again. But it was the expression in those eyes that paralyzed him. Not the blank stare of an animal, but something that suggested complex thought, emotional depth, and a kind of alien intelligence that was both human and utterly foreign. The creature opened its mouth and spoke, in that same impossibly deep voice he'd heard earlier. The words were clear enough that he almost understood them, as if they were in a language just different enough from English to be incomprehensible. But the tone was unmistakable. A question directed at him, demanding an answer. When he didn't respond, the creature tilted its head and spoke again, more sharply this time. It was trying to communicate with him, trying to get him to respond in some way. But Jeremiah's throat was locked with terror, his vocal cords paralyzed by the sheer impossibility of what he was experiencing. The lightning faded, and in the darkness that followed, he heard the creature moving. Not attacking, but repositioning itself, finding a better angle of approach. It was being cautious, patient, showing a level of tactical thinking that belonged to no animal in his experience. Other sounds came from the darkness around him, the soft scrape of claws on stone, the rustle of movement through wet vegetation. The other two creatures were closing in, taking positions that would cut off any escape route. They were working together with military precision, coordinating their attack through some form of communication he couldn't detect. Jeremiah realized that his rifle, his human intelligence, his years of hunting experience meant nothing against predators like these. They were faster, stronger, and apparently smarter than any animal he'd ever encountered. In their domain, by their rules, he was just another prey animal waiting to be killed. The thought broke the paralysis that had gripped him. If he was going to die on this mountain, he wasn't going to die cowering in a hole. He was going to go down fighting like a man, like his ancestors had taught him. He raised the rifle and fired into the darkness where he'd last seen the creature. The muzzle flash lit up the rocks for a split second, revealing the creature diving to one side with inhuman speed. The bullet sparked off stone where it had been crouched a moment before, and the sound of the gunshot echoed across the canyon like thunder. Immediately, all three creatures began vocalizing, not the deep, speech-like sounds he'd heard before, but wild, keening cries that raised every hair on his body. They were angry or excited, or communicating in some way that his human brain couldn't interpret, but they weren't fleeing. If anything, the gunshot seemed to have energized them. He worked the bolt, ejecting the spent case and chambering a fresh round. 4 shots left. The creatures were moving around him now, no longer trying to be stealthy. He could hear them scrambling over the rocks, positioning themselves for a coordinated attack. Another lightning flash revealed one of them 30 feet to his left, moving along the ridgeline with a flowing, 4-limbed gait that covered ground at an incredible speed. He swung the rifle toward it and fired, but the lightning had already faded, and he was shooting blind. The bullet whined off into the darkness. 3 shots left. The creature he'd shot at let out another of those keening cries, and the other 2 answered from different positions. They were communicating their locations, setting up a crossfire that would make it impossible for him to cover all angles at once. Jeremiah scrambled deeper into his overhang, pressing his back against the solid stone. It wasn't much protection, but it at least ensured that nothing could attack him from behind. He held the rifle ready, swinging the muzzle back and forth to cover the most likely approaches. The rain was tapering off, and the lightning was moving away to the east. Soon he would be in complete darkness, and whatever advantages his rifle provided would disappear. In the dark, against creatures that could apparently see better than he could, his remaining 3 shots might as well be blank cartridges. One of them was climbing again, coming up the slope directly in front of his position. He could hear it moving from rock to rock, taking its time, no longer concerned about stealth. It knew he was trapped, knew that sooner or later it would reach him. He aimed at the sound and waited, finger on the trigger. At point-blank range, even in the dark, he couldn't miss. But the creature seemed to understand this too, because it stopped just outside what he estimated to be accurate shooting distance. Then it began to make a new sound, something he'd never heard before. It started as a low hum, almost below the threshold of hearing, then rose in pitch and volume to become something like a song. Other voices joined in from the darkness, creating a harmony that was both beautiful and terrifying. The sound seemed to come from all directions at once, surrounding him, penetrating into his bones and making his teeth ache. The song went on for several minutes, rising and falling in complex patterns that suggested structure and meaning. It was clearly a form of communication, but unlike anything in his experience. No animal he knew of was capable of producing sounds like these, sounds that combined the vocal range of whales with the complexity of human music. When the song finally ended, silence returned to the mountain. But it was a different kind of silence now, expectant and heavy with menace. The creatures were still there. He could sense their presence, but they had gone completely still, as if waiting for something. Minutes passed. Jeremiah's hands began to shake from the combination of cold, fear, and adrenaline. His clothes were soaked through, and the emergency blanket provided little protection against the mountain chill. If he didn't find warmth and shelter soon, hypothermia would kill him long before the creatures did. Then he heard a new sound, coming from far below in the valley. It was mechanical, artificial, the rumble of an engine echoing off the canyon walls. For a moment, his heart leaped with hope. Someone else was out there, someone with a vehicle who might be able to help him. But the sound was wrong. It wasn't the steady drone of a truck or ATV moving along a trail. It was his ATV, and it was being driven by someone who didn't know how to operate it properly. The engine revved erratically, rose to a high whine, then dropped to idle. Gears ground as the operator tried to figure out the transmission. Someone, or something, had found his ATV and was trying to use it. The realization hit him like a physical blow. The creatures weren't just intelligent predators. They were curious about human technology, willing to investigate and experiment with unfamiliar objects. And if they could figure out how to operate his ATV, they might be able to track it back to the trailhead, to his truck, to the road that led back to civilization. The engine sound faded as whoever was operating the ATV drove it away from his position. But the implications were terrifying. These creatures weren't just territorial animals defending their habitat. They were learning, adapting, expanding their understanding of the human world. In the distance, he could see lights beginning to appear in the valley below. The storm was passing, and the clouds were breaking up enough to let starlight through. The lights were too far away and too scattered to be from a town. They looked more like individual houses or cabins scattered through the forest. One of the creatures called softly from the darkness nearby, and another answered from the opposite direction. The sounds were quieter now, more subdued, as if they were communicating in whispers. They were still there, still watching, but something had changed. The aggressive urgency was gone, replaced by what seemed like patience and calculation. Jeremiah checked his watch. 11:47 p.m. Dawn was still 6 hours away, and he had no idea if he could survive that long in the wet cold. His emergency supplies were minimal, designed for short-term survival, not an extended siege. The energy bars would provide some calories, but not enough to maintain body heat through a mountain night. He pulled the emergency blanket tighter around his shoulders and tried to think rationally about his situation. The creatures had demonstrated that they could reach his position whenever they wanted to, but they seemed to be holding back, waiting for something. Maybe they were nocturnal hunters who preferred to attack in the darkest hours before dawn. Maybe they were testing his responses, learning about human behavior the same way they'd experimented with his ATV. Or maybe they were simply patient predators who understood that time was on their side. In the cold, without proper shelter, his condition would deteriorate steadily through the night. By dawn, he might be too weak to resist effectively. Why risk injury in a direct assault when they could simply wait for hypothermia to do their work for them? The thought made him angry, and anger was better than fear. If these things thought they could wait him out, they were underestimating human determination. He'd survived worse conditions during his time in the Marines, during hunting trips that went wrong, during the hard years after his divorce when everything in his life seemed to be falling apart. He wasn't going to die on this mountain because some oversized animals thought they were smarter than he was. He took one of the energy bars from his pack and ate it slowly, forcing himself to chew each bite thoroughly to extract maximum nutrition. The chocolate and nuts tasted like cardboard, but the sugar hit his bloodstream and provided a small boost of warmth. He followed it with a careful sip of water, just enough to moisten his mouth without depleting his limited supply. Then he settled back against the stone and began the long wait for dawn. The creatures stayed with him through the night, never attacking but never leaving. He could hear them moving occasionally, soft sounds that might have been breathing or shifting position. Sometimes one of them would call softly to the others, brief exchanges in their impossible language that seemed to convey complex information in just a few syllables. Around 3 in the morning, when his body heat was at its lowest and his strength was beginning to fail, one of them approached his position again. He could hear it climbing the slope, moving with the same deliberate care it had shown earlier. But this time, it stopped well outside rifle range and began to make that humming sound again. The song was different now, softer and more complex, with harmonies that seemed to shift and flow like water. It was hauntingly beautiful, and despite his terror, Jeremiah found himself listening with something approaching fascination. The creature was clearly intelligent, clearly capable of complex thought and emotion, and the song suggested a level of sophistication that challenged everything he thought he knew about the natural world. Other voices joined in, creating a harmony that seemed to fill the entire canyon. The sound was hypnotic, almost relaxing, and he found his eyelids growing heavy despite the cold and fear. He forced himself to stay alert, recognizing that the song might be some form of psychological warfare, a way of lulling him into a vulnerable state. But part of him wondered if the creatures were simply trying to communicate, trying to establish some form of contact that didn't involve violence. The songs were too complex, too structured to be random vocalizations. They meant something, conveyed information or emotion or intention in ways that his human brain couldn't decode. The singing continued for almost an hour, then gradually faded into silence. When it was over, Jeremiah felt oddly bereft, as if something beautiful had been taken away from him. But the creatures were still there, still watching, still waiting for dawn, and whatever they planned to do when the sun rose. He dozed fitfully through the last hours of darkness, jerking awake every few minutes to check his surroundings. Each time, the creatures were still there, patient as stones, waiting with the inexorable certainty of natural predators who knew that time and environment were their allies. Dawn came slowly, a gradual lightening of the eastern sky that revealed the true extent of his predicament. He was perched on a narrow ledge near the top of a steep, rocky slope that dropped away into dense forest on all sides. The terrain offered few escape routes, and all of them led down through territory that the creatures obviously knew better than he did. As the light improved, he began to see them more clearly. They were positioned at strategic points around his refuge, each one commanding a different approach route. In the growing daylight, they looked even more impossible than they had in the lightning flashes. They were enormous, easily 8 feet tall and massively built, with proportions that seemed designed for both strength and agility. Their fur was dark brown, almost black, and matted with moisture from the night's rain. They moved with a fluid grace that suggested perfect adaptation to the rocky terrain, and their eyes held an intelligence that was unmistakably sapient. The closest one, maybe 60 yards downhill from his position, seemed to be studying him with the same fascination he felt looking at it. Its head was tilted slightly to one side, and its expression suggested curiosity rather than aggression. It was trying to understand him, trying to categorize him in whatever mental framework these creatures used to make sense of their world. Jeremiah raised his rifle and centered the crosshairs on the creature's chest. At this range, with good light and a steady rest, he couldn't miss. The bullet would punch through fur and flesh and probably drop the creature where it stood. But killing one of them would accomplish nothing except to enrage the other two, and he still had no escape route that wouldn't take him directly through their territory. The creature seemed to understand the threat posed by the rifle. It watched him steadily, showing no fear but also making no threatening moves. It was waiting to see what he would do, giving him the choice of whether this encounter would end in violence or something else. Jeremiah lowered the rifle slightly, not removing the threat but reducing it. The creature responded by settling into a more relaxed posture, sitting back on its haunches in a way that suggested it was prepared to wait as long as necessary. They studied each other in the growing light, predator and prey locked in a moment of mutual recognition. Jeremiah found himself thinking about his grandfather's stories, the old Lakota legends about the forest people, the ones who walked like men but lived apart from human civilization. His rational mind had always dismissed those stories as folklore, remnants of a more superstitious time when people needed myths to explain the unknown. But looking at the creature below him, seeing the intelligence in its eyes and the sophisticated coordination of its behavior, he began to wonder if the legends had been based on something real, something that lived in the deep forests, something that had learned to avoid human contact, something that existed in the spaces between the known and the unknown. The standoff continued for almost an hour. The creatures showed no signs of impatience or aggression, and Jeremiah began to hope that they might simply lose interest and wander away. But that hope was shattered when he heard the sound of voices coming up the slope from below, human voices, calling his name. "Jeremiah! Jeremiah Black Elk!" It was a search party, probably organized by his ex-wife when he failed to return home the previous evening. He could hear multiple voices, maybe 4 or 5 people, climbing through the forest in his direction. They were still far away, probably following the blood trail he'd left when tracking the elk, but they were definitely coming toward his position. The creatures heard the voices too. All 3 of them went rigid, their heads turning toward the sound like hunting dogs catching a scent. For the first time since the encounter began, they showed signs of agitation, shifting their weight and making soft vocalizations to each other. One of them, the largest, began moving downhill toward the approaching voices. Its movement was purposeful, directed, and Jeremiah realized with growing horror that it was going to intercept the search party. These people had no idea what they were walking into. They were coming up the mountain to rescue him, and they were about to encounter something that could kill them all. He had to warn them, had to get them to turn back before it was too late, but shouting would only draw the creature's attention to his exact position, and any movement from his refuge would be interpreted as hostile action. The voices were getting closer, maybe half a mile away. He could make out individual speakers now, his ex-wife Sarah, her new husband Mike, probably a couple of volunteers from the local search and rescue team. Good people, brave people who had no idea they were walking into a nightmare. The largest creature had disappeared into the forest, moving downhill with frightening speed and silence. The other two remained in position around his refuge, but they were clearly agitated now, torn between maintaining their vigil over him and responding to the new threat approaching from below. Jeremiah made his decision. He stood up from his shelter, rifle in hand, and began climbing uphill toward the ridge. If he could reach the top of the canyon and circle around, he might be able to intercept the search party and warn them off before they encountered the creatures. Immediately, the two remaining creatures began moving to intercept him. But their movement was not aggressive. It was herding behavior designed to drive him away from the approaching humans. They wanted to separate him from the search party, to prevent any kind of contact or rescue. He fired a shot into the air, hoping the sound would carry down to the search party and warn them that something was wrong. The gunshot echoed across the canyon, and the voices below fell silent. Then he heard them calling his name again, but with more urgency now, moving faster up the slope. The creatures were closing in on him from both sides, no longer patient, no longer willing to wait. Their coordinated movement suggested they had made some kind of decision, reached some kind of consensus about how to handle the situation, and that decision apparently involved preventing any contact between him and the approaching humans. He fired again, this time at the nearest creature. The bullet sparked off stone just inches from its feet, and it leaped backward with inhuman agility. But it didn't flee. Instead, it began making that keening cry again, calling to its companions with obvious urgency. The sound that answered from below made Jeremiah's blood freeze. It was humans screaming, multiple voices, men and women, crying out in terror and pain. The search party had encountered the third creature, and the meeting was not going well. He abandoned all caution and began running uphill, scrambling over rocks and through brush in a desperate attempt to reach a position where he could help the people below. Behind him, the two creatures gave chase, but they were no longer trying to capture him. They were trying to drive him away, to prevent him from interfering with whatever was happening down in the forest. The screaming continued for what seemed like hours, but was probably only minutes. Then it stopped, replaced by an ominous silence that was somehow worse than the sounds of terror had been. Jeremiah reached the ridge and looked down into the valley, but the forest canopy blocked his view of whatever had happened below. He pulled out his cell phone, hoping against logic that he might have signal up here. The screen showed one bar, barely enough for a text message. With shaking fingers, he typed out a message to 911. Emergency. People attacked. Black Hills need help. He hit send and watched the phone struggle to transmit the message, the signal bar flickering between 1 and 0. The message failed to send. He tried again, reducing it to just emergency Black Hills, but even that wouldn't go through. His phone was useless, his isolation complete. Behind him, he could hear the creatures moving through the rocks, but they were no longer pursuing him. They seemed to have achieved whatever objective they'd set for themselves down in the forest, and now they were withdrawing, fading back into the wilderness like shadows retreating from the dawn. Jeremiah spent the rest of the morning working his way down the far side of the ridge, trying to find a route that would take him back to his truck without passing through the area where the search party had been attacked. The terrain was unfamiliar, and several times he had to backtrack when cliffs or impassable thickets blocked his path. It was almost noon when he finally reached a Forest Service road that he recognized. His truck was parked at a trailhead 5 miles to the west, and he began walking, staying on the gravel road where the going was easier and the sight lines were clear. Every shadow made him jump, every sound made him reach for his rifle, but he encountered nothing more threatening than a few startled deer. The truck started on the first try, a sound so normal and reassuring that he almost cried with relief. He drove back toward town, stopping at the first place with cell phone coverage to call 911. The dispatcher was professional but skeptical, especially when he tried to explain what had happened to the search party. "Sir, we don't have any record of a search and rescue operation in that area. Are you sure about the location?" He gave them the coordinates as best he could, describing the canyon where he'd encountered the creatures and the approximate area where he'd heard the screaming. The dispatcher promised to send someone to investigate, but her tone suggested she thought he was either confused or suffering from exposure. The next few hours were a blur of police interviews, medical examinations, and frustrated attempts to make people understand what had happened. The search party, if it had ever existed, had vanished without a trace. No missing person reports, no abandoned vehicles, no families looking for lost relatives. It was as if the people he'd heard calling his name had never existed at all. The police searched the area he described but found nothing, no bodies, no blood, no signs of struggle. They did find the elk he'd shot, but the carcass had been torn apart by scavengers, and the search team attributed the damage to bears or mountain lions. His ATV was eventually recovered by a park ranger, abandoned in a creek bed miles from where he'd left it. The engine had been run without oil and was completely destroyed. The ranger suggested that joyriders had stolen it and wrecked it, a common problem in the area. Dr. Martinez at the county hospital diagnosed him with severe dehydration, mild hypothermia, and acute stress reaction. She recommended counseling and prescribed medications for anxiety and sleep disorders. When he tried to tell her about the creatures, she nodded sympathetically and made notes about possible hallucinations brought on by stress and exposure. The story made the local newspaper as a human interest piece about a hunter who got lost in the woods and was rescued by search volunteers. There was no mention of the creatures, no reference to the screaming he'd heard from the forest below. The reporter had spoken to the sheriff's department and the hospital, and their version of events made no mention of anything unusual. Within a week, Jeremiah found himself questioning his own memories. The experience had been so far outside normal reality that his rational mind began looking for alternative explanations. Hypothermia could cause hallucinations, dehydration could affect judgment and perception, stress could make you hear things that weren't there, see things that couldn't exist, but the smell lingered for days after his return. His clothes, his gear, even his truck carried traces of that indescribable stench. No amount of washing could remove it completely. Sarah mentioned it when she came to check on him, wrinkling her nose and asking if he'd been near a dead animal. Mike suggested he might have rolled in bear scat without realizing it. The smell was real. Whatever had happened in those woods, whatever he'd encountered on that mountain, it had left physical evidence that couldn't be explained away by stress or exposure. But as the days passed, even that faded, until he began to wonder if he'd imagined that too. He never hunted the Black Hills again. In fact, he never hunted anywhere again. The thought of being alone in the wilderness, of being watched by unseen eyes, was more than his damaged psyche could handle. He sold his rifles, gave away his hunting gear, and took a job in town where he could be around people all day. The nightmares came every few weeks, always the same scenario. He's back on that rocky ledge, surrounded by intelligent eyes that watch him from the darkness. Sometimes the creatures speak to him in their impossible language, asking questions he can't answer. Sometimes they sing their complex harmonies while he slowly freezes to death. Sometimes he hears the screaming from the forest below, and he knows that this time he won't escape. He tried therapy, tried medication, tried everything the doctors suggested, but nothing could erase the memory of those eyes, the intelligence he'd seen there, the recognition of something that shouldn't exist, but clearly did. He'd looked into the face of something that challenged everything humans thought they knew about the natural world, and it had looked back at him with equal curiosity and understanding. 6 months later, while researching sleep disorders online, he came across a forum dedicated to cryptozoology and unexplained encounters. Reading through the posts, he found dozens of similar stories from all over the Pacific Northwest and the Rocky Mountains. Hikers who'd been stalked by unseen predators, hunters who'd found impossible tracks, campers who'd heard complex vocalizations from the forest that sounded almost like language. Most of the stories were dismissed by authorities as hoaxes or misidentifications. Bears, mountain lions, confused memories, overactive imaginations. But the details were consistent. Large, bipedal creatures with human-like intelligence, sophisticated coordination, and an apparent policy of avoiding direct contact with humans whenever possible. The forum members called them by various names: Sasquatch, Bigfoot, wood apes, forest people. But reading through their accounts, Jeremiah recognized the same intelligence he'd encountered, the same patient hunting behavior, the same complex vocalizations that suggested language and culture. He created an account and posted his own story, carefully omitting details that might identify the specific location. The response was immediate and overwhelming. Dozens of private messages from people who'd had similar experiences, people who'd been dismissed by authorities and ridiculed by friends and family. One message stood out from the rest. It was from a retired forest ranger named Thompson, who'd worked in the Olympic Peninsula for 30 years. He'd encountered the creatures multiple times, always at a distance, always briefly. But he'd made detailed observations of their behavior, their apparent social structure, their methods of avoiding human contact. According to Thompson, the creatures were highly intelligent, possibly more intelligent than humans in some ways. They lived in small family groups scattered throughout the remote wilderness areas of the Pacific Coast and Rocky Mountains. They had a complex language, sophisticated tool use, and what appeared to be a deliberate policy of remaining hidden from human civilization. Most importantly, they were learning. Each generation seemed to be better at avoiding detection, better at understanding human technology and behavior. They studied humans the same way humans studied them, gathering information and adapting their strategies based on what they learned. Thompson's theory was that they represented a parallel evolution of intelligence, a branch of the primate family tree that had developed sapience independently of humans. They'd learned to coexist with human expansion by becoming invisible, by perfecting the art of hiding in plain sight. But as human technology improved, as wilderness areas shrank, as satellite surveillance and trail cameras became more common, their ability to remain hidden was being challenged. Some groups were becoming more aggressive, more willing to take risks to protect their territory. Others were adapting by moving deeper into the wilderness, abandoning traditional territories for more remote locations. The message ended with a warning. Thompson believed that the creatures were approaching a crisis point. They could either reveal themselves and attempt some form of coexistence with humans, or they could escalate their territorial defense to the point where contact became inevitable and violent. Reading the message, Jeremiah felt a chill that had nothing to do with the mountain cold he'd experienced. He thought about the intelligence he'd seen in those eyes, the sophisticated coordination of the hunt, the apparent decision to eliminate the search party rather than risk exposure. These weren't mindless animals defending territory. They were rational beings making strategic decisions about survival. And if Thompson was right, if they were being forced to choose between revelation and escalation, then what he'd experienced in the Black Hills might be just the beginning. He closed his laptop and walked to the window, looking out at the lights of the town where he'd spent his entire life. For 37 years, he'd hunted these mountains, thinking he knew every animal that lived there, every danger they contained. But something else had been there all along, watching him as carefully as he'd watched the deer and elk, learning about human behavior while remaining completely undetected. The thought that they might still be out there, that they might be watching him even now, should have been terrifying. But instead, he felt a strange sense of anticipation. Whatever they were, wherever they'd come from, they represented something extraordinary, intelligence that had evolved separately from humans, a parallel development of consciousness that challenged every assumption about what it meant to be the dominant species on Earth. Maybe someday, if he was very lucky and very careful, he would encounter them again. But next time, he hoped, it would be on their terms rather than his. Next time, he would go into the mountains not as a hunter, but as someone seeking answers to questions that science couldn't yet ask. Outside his window, the mountains rose dark against the star-filled sky, holding their secrets in shadows and silence. Somewhere out there, in caves and hidden valleys that no human had ever mapped, an ancient intelligence continued its patient existence, watching and learning and waiting for the day when hiding would no longer be possible. And Jeremiah Black Elk, who had looked into their eyes and survived to tell the tale, would be ready when that day came. The next case. The Turner incident. Michael Turner had been hunting these woods since he was 12 years old, following the same deer trails his grandfather had shown him through the dense pine forests of northern Idaho. At 34, he considered himself an experienced outdoorsman, comfortable enough in the wilderness to camp alone for days at a time. The Clearwater National Forest felt like his backyard, familiar and safe, which made what happened during those 48 hours in October all the more unsettling. He'd driven up from Coeur d'Alene on a Thursday afternoon, taking the winding Forest Service roads deeper into the mountains than most hunters bothered to go. The farther from civilization, the better the chances of finding an untouched deer population. His beat-up Chevy Silverado handled the rough terrain with ease, loaded down with his gear and supplies for a long weekend hunt. The weather forecast called for clear skies and cool temperatures, perfect conditions for tracking. The first sign that something was different came as he set up camp near Beaver Creek, about 15 miles from the nearest maintained road. The forest was too quiet. In all his years hunting these mountains, Michael had never experienced such complete silence. No bird calls echoed through the trees. No squirrels chattered from the branches overhead. Even the wind seemed to have died away, leaving the towering pines motionless against the gray October sky. Michael paused while hammering in tent stakes, his head tilted to listen. The absence of sound felt unnatural, almost oppressive. He'd learned to read the forest's moods over decades of hunting, and this silence suggested something had spooked every living creature for miles around. Large predators could have that effect, but even then, some sounds usually remained. This was different, like the entire ecosystem had simply stopped breathing. He finished setting up his camp methodically, trying to shake off the uneasy feeling. His orange dome tent sat on a small clearing beside the creek, positioned to catch the morning sun. A ring of stones marked his fire pit, already loaded with kindling and dry pine logs. His truck was parked 30 yards away, backed against a cluster of boulders for wind protection. Everything was arranged exactly as he'd done hundreds of times before, yet the wrongness in the air persisted. As darkness approached, Michael built his fire and settled in for the evening. The flames cast dancing shadows across the surrounding trees, their orange light reaching maybe 20 feet into the blackness beyond. He'd brought a paperback novel and planned to read for a while before turning in early, wanting to be on the deer trails before dawn. The fire crackled pleasantly, and gradually the familiar routine of camp life began to ease his tension. That's when he first noticed the smell. It drifted through the camp on a barely perceptible breeze, faint but distinctly unpleasant. Not the clean scent of pine and wood smoke he expected, but something else entirely. Something organic and rotten, like meat left too long in the sun. Michael lifted his nose, testing the air more carefully. The odor came and went, never strong enough to pinpoint, but persistent enough to be troubling. He'd encountered plenty of unpleasant smells in the wilderness before. Dead animals, sulfur springs, even the occasional patch of swamp gas. This was different though, carrying an almost musky undertone that reminded him of the monkey house at the zoo, but magnified and corrupted. His hunting instincts, honed by years of tracking game, told him this wasn't natural decay. This was something alive. Michael stood and walked to the edge of his firelight, peering into the darkness beyond. The beam of his flashlight penetrated only a few dozen yards before the forest swallowed it completely. He listened intently, but heard nothing except the gentle murmur of Beaver Creek flowing over its rocky bed. Still, the feeling of being watched pressed against him like a physical weight. He returned to his folding chair beside the fire, but found concentration impossible. The book lay forgotten in his lap as he kept glancing toward the tree line, searching for any movement in the shadows. The smell came again, stronger this time, making him wrinkle his nose in disgust. Whatever was producing that stench was getting closer. A stick snapped somewhere in the darkness to his left. Michael's head whipped around, his hand instinctively moving toward the rifle propped against his truck. The sound had been loud and distinct, the unmistakable crack of someone or something stepping on dead wood. He grabbed his flashlight and aimed it toward the sound, but the beam revealed only empty forest. Still, something large had definitely moved out there, something heavy enough to break a substantial branch. "Hello," he called out, feeling foolish even as the word left his mouth. "Anyone out there?" His voice seemed to die just beyond the firelight, swallowed by the oppressive silence. No response came, but Michael had the distinct impression that something was listening, considering his words. The hair on the back of his neck stood up, a primal warning system that had kept his ancestors alive for thousands of years. He added more wood to the fire, building the flames higher and extending his circle of light. The extra illumination should have been comforting, but instead it only emphasized how much darkness lay beyond its reach. Michael positioned his rifle across his knees and waited, every sense straining to detect whatever was sharing the forest with him. The next sound came from behind his tent. This time it wasn't a breaking stick, but something much more unsettling, a low, rumbling growl that seemed to vibrate through the ground itself. The sound was deep and resonant, unlike anything Michael had ever heard in these mountains. Bears could growl, but this was different, carrying an almost human quality that made his skin crawl. It lasted only a few seconds before fading away, leaving him wondering if he'd imagined it. Michael stood slowly, his rifle now clutched in both hands. The smart thing would be to pack up immediately and drive back to civilization. But 20 years of hunting had given him a stubborn streak when it came to being intimidated by wildlife. Besides, his truck was parked between him and whatever had made that sound. He'd have to cross open ground to reach it, potentially exposing himself to something he couldn't see or identify. The growl came again, this time from his right, at least 50 yards from where he'd heard it before. Whatever was out there was moving, circling his camp just beyond the range of his firelight. Michael turned slowly, trying to track the sound, but it faded before he could pinpoint its location. The silence that followed felt even more ominous than before. He threw another log on the fire, sending sparks spiraling up into the star-filled sky. The flames leaped higher, pushing back the darkness by a few precious feet. Michael wished he'd brought a more powerful lantern, something that could illuminate the entire clearing. His handheld flashlight, while adequate for normal camping, felt pitifully inadequate against the vast blackness surrounding him. A new sound drifted through the night, a rhythmic thumping that took him a moment to identify. Something was hitting the trees, hard enough to create a steady drumbeat that echoed through the forest. The impacts came in groups of 3 or 4, pause, then repeated from a different location. It reminded Michael of a woodpecker, but no bird made sounds like that in the middle of the night, and certainly not with such force. The thumping stopped abruptly, replaced by a rustling sound, as something large moved through the underbrush. Michael could track its progress by the disturbance it created, a path of snapping twigs and scraping branches that seemed to circle his camp in a wide arc. Whatever was out there was massive, pushing through vegetation that would turn aside a deer or elk. Michael's hands began to shake as adrenaline flooded his system. His rational mind tried to convince him this was just a curious bear, but his instincts screamed that something was fundamentally wrong with this situation. Bears didn't behave this way, methodically circling human camps while remaining hidden. They either approached boldly, looking for food, or avoided human contact entirely. The rustling stopped directly behind his tent. Michael spun around, raising his rifle toward the sound, but saw nothing except the orange fabric of his tent glowing in the firelight. For several long seconds, absolute silence reigned. Then slowly, a shadow began to move across the tent wall, cast by something standing just beyond the range of his fire. The shadow was enormous. It started at ground level and rose upward, higher and higher, until it reached well above the tent's peak. Michael watched in growing horror as the shadow shifted slightly, revealing what looked like massive shoulders and an elongated head. The silhouette was vaguely human in shape, but wrong in proportions, too tall and broad to be anything he could rationalize. His finger found the safety on his rifle, clicking it off with a metallic snap that sounded impossibly loud in the silence. The shadow froze at the sound, as if whatever cast it was suddenly aware of his attention. For a heart-stopping moment, hunter and hunted regarded each other across the flickering firelight, separated by nothing more than the thin fabric of a camping tent. Then the shadow moved. It didn't walk away or fade gradually into the darkness. Instead, it simply vanished, there 1 second and gone the next, as if whatever had cast it possessed an impossible ability to melt into the forest. Michael stared at the empty tent wall, trying to convince himself he'd imagined the entire thing, but the memory of that massive silhouette was burned into his retinas. He spent the rest of the night feeding the fire and scanning the tree line, his rifle never leaving his hands. The mysterious sounds didn't return, but neither did the normal sounds of a healthy forest. The oppressive silence continued, broken only by the crackling of burning wood and the distant murmur of Beaver Creek. Michael dozed fitfully in his chair, jerking awake at every real or imagined sound. Dawn brought little relief. The forest remained eerily quiet as pale sunlight filtered through the pine canopy, revealing a camp that looked exactly as he'd left it. No tracks marked the soft earth around his tent. No broken branches indicated where something large had passed. In the harsh light of morning, Michael almost convinced himself the previous night had been nothing more than an overactive imagination, combined with too much caffeine and too little sleep. Almost. The smell lingered. It was fainter now, barely detectable in the cool morning air, but unmistakably the same musky stench that had first alerted him to the presence of something unnatural. Michael walked the perimeter of his camp, searching for any physical evidence of his nighttime visitor. The soft ground near the creek showed only his own boot prints and the delicate hoof marks of deer that had come to drink before dawn. He was about to dismiss the entire experience as stress-induced paranoia when he found the first real sign. 20 yards from his tent, on the far side of a massive Douglas fir, someone or something had stripped bark from the trunk in long vertical gouges. The wounds were fresh, oozing clear sap that hadn't had time to harden. Michael approached the tree carefully, his rifle still in hand, and examined the damage more closely. The gouges started about 7 feet off the ground and extended upward for another 3 feet, far too high for any bear to reach while standing on its hind legs. They were also too wide and deep to have been made by claws. These looked more like the work of massive fingers, as if something had gripped the tree and torn away chunks of bark in frustration or rage. Michael measured one of the gouges with his hand, spreading his fingers as wide as possible. The mark was easily twice the width of his palm, suggesting whatever had made it possessed hands of enormous size. He looked around for other signs, but found nothing except a few broken branches at shoulder height, snapped cleanly, as if something very tall had walked through without ducking. The rational part of his mind catalogued possible explanations. A bear with some kind of genetic abnormality, an elk scraping velvet from its antlers, though the wrong time of year and wrong type of damage. Maybe someone playing an elaborate prank, though he couldn't imagine how they'd manage to remain hidden while making such noise, or why they'd choose him as a target. None of the explanations felt right. Michael returned to his camp and forced himself to eat breakfast, though his appetite had completely vanished. The instant coffee tasted like ash in his mouth, and even the familiar routine of cleaning his rifle failed to calm his nerves. Every few minutes, he found himself glancing toward the damaged tree, trying to convince himself he'd misinterpreted what he'd seen. By mid-morning, he'd made his decision. This hunting trip was over. Michael began breaking down his camp with methodical efficiency, eager to put as much distance as possible between himself and whatever had visited him in the night. The tent folded quickly into its stuff sack. His sleeping bag and cooking gear disappeared into his pack. Within an hour, no trace remained of his presence, except the cold ashes of his fire. He was loading the last of his gear into the truck when he heard the whistle. It started low and rose in pitch, a clear, melodious sound that seemed to come from every direction at once. Not the sharp tweet of a bird or the breathy call of an elk, but something musical and deliberately crafted. The whistle lasted about 10 seconds before fading into silence, leaving Michael frozen beside his truck with a sleeping bag clutched in his hands. No animal made sounds like that. The whistle came again, this time from a different direction, answered immediately by a similar call from across the creek. Michael's blood ran cold as he realized what he was hearing. These were signals, communication between multiple individuals who were coordinating their movements. His isolated camping spot was no longer isolated. It was surrounded. Michael threw his sleeping bag into the truck bed and slammed the tailgate shut. His hands shook as he fumbled for his keys, the metal ring slipping through his sweaty fingers twice before he managed to grip it firmly. The diesel engine turned over on the first try, its familiar rumble providing a momentary sense of security. He threw the truck into reverse and began backing away from the clearing, his eyes constantly scanning the tree line for any sign of movement. The forest remained still and silent, but Michael could feel eyes watching him from the shadows. The sensation was so strong, it made his skin crawl, as if invisible crosshairs were tracking his every movement. The whistle sounded again, much closer this time. Michael's foot pressed harder on the accelerator, and the truck bounced violently over the rough ground as he maneuvered between the trees. A low-hanging branch scraped across his windshield with a screech of green wood against glass. He fought the urge to floor the gas pedal, knowing that reckless speed on this terrain would only get him stuck or damage his vehicle. A shadow moved between the trees to his left. Michael caught just a glimpse of something large and dark stepping behind a massive pine, there and gone so quickly he might have imagined it. But the image burned in his mind was of something walking upright, something too tall and broad to be human, but too purposeful in its movements to be any animal he knew. The Forest Service road stretched ahead like a lifeline, its rutted surface marking the boundary between the deep wilderness and the civilized world. Michael pushed his truck harder, the suspension groaning as it absorbed the punishment of rocks and potholes. Behind him, the whistling continued, a haunting melody that seemed to follow his retreat. He was still 2 miles from the main road when his truck began to overheat. The temperature gauge crept steadily upward as Michael watched in growing panic. Steam began to leak from under the hood, carrying the acrid smell of hot coolant. He had two choices: stop and risk whatever was following him, or push forward and potentially destroy his engine in the middle of nowhere. Michael chose to keep driving. The whistling grew louder behind him, no longer the distant signals he'd heard at camp, but something much closer and more immediate. It sounded like a hunting party closing in on wounded prey, tightening the noose with each coordinated call. The temperature gauge moved into the red zone, and Michael could hear the engine beginning to knock under the strain. The main road appeared ahead like salvation itself, a ribbon of smooth asphalt that represented safety and civilization. Michael's truck limped the final 100 yards, steam now pouring from under the hood in a steady white cloud. He pulled onto the pavement and immediately shut off the engine, listening to the metal tick and pop as it began to cool. The whistling had stopped. Michael sat in his truck for several minutes, hands still gripping the steering wheel as his heart rate slowly returned to normal. The silence that surrounded him now was different from the oppressive quiet of the deep woods. This was the normal absence of sound that came with an empty mountain road, broken occasionally by the distant hum of traffic and the rustle of wind through roadside vegetation. He raised the hood and surveyed the damage. Coolant had sprayed across the engine compartment, and several hoses showed signs of stress from the overheating. The damage was repairable, but it would require parts and tools he didn't have with him. Michael used his cell phone to call for a tow truck, grateful to find he had a signal again after days in the communication dead zone of the deep forest. While he waited for help to arrive, Michael walked to the edge of the woods and stared back down the Forest Service road he'd just traveled. Nothing moved among the trees, and no sounds drifted from the depths of the forest. Whatever had been following him seemed content to remain in its domain, watching from the shadows as he retreated to the safety of the modern world. The tow truck arrived an hour later, driven by a grizzled mechanic named Bill, who'd been pulling stranded vehicles out of these mountains for 30 years. As they loaded Michael's truck onto the flatbed, Bill asked the usual questions about what had happened and whether he'd seen any wildlife during his hunting trip. Michael found himself hesitating, unsure how to explain his experience without sounding crazy. "Just the usual," he finally said. "Some deer sign, but nothing worth taking a shot at." Bill nodded and continued securing the tie-down straps. "You're smart to get out early. Fish and Game's been getting some strange reports from this area lately. Hunters finding their camps trashed, weird sounds in the night. Probably just bears getting into garbage, but you never know." "What kind of weird sounds?" Michael asked, trying to keep his voice casual. "Oh, you know how it is," Bill replied, waving a dismissive hand. "Bunch of city folks come up here, and every owl hoot sounds like a monster. Though I'll admit, some of the descriptions have been pretty consistent. Whistling sounds, like someone calling for help. Makes the hair on your neck stand up, you know." Michael knew exactly what he meant. The ride back to town passed in relative silence. Michael lost in thought as familiar landmarks rolled past the passenger window. By the time they reached Bill's garage in Coeur d'Alene, he'd almost convinced himself that the entire experience had a rational explanation. Strange acoustics in the mountains could distort normal animal sounds. The damaged tree could have been caused by any number of natural phenomena. The shadow on his tent wall might have been cast by a curious elk or an unusually large bear. Almost convinced, but not quite. Bill estimated it would take 2 days to get the necessary parts and complete the repairs. Michael arranged for a rental car and drove to his small apartment on the outskirts of town, eager for the familiar comforts of electricity, running water, and solid walls. A hot shower helped wash away the lingering smell of wood smoke and something else he couldn't quite identify. Something musky and wild that seemed to have soaked into his skin. That night, Michael sat at his kitchen table with a cup of coffee and tried to write down everything he remembered about his aborted hunting trip. The exercise felt therapeutic at first, a way of organizing his thoughts and perhaps finding rational explanations for what he'd experienced. But as he wrote, the memories became more vivid rather than less, and the fear he'd felt in the forest returned with surprising intensity. He found himself getting up repeatedly to check the locks on his doors and windows, even though he lived on the 3rd floor of a modern apartment building. The sound of his neighbors moving around in the units above and below, normally just background noise, now made him jump every time. Sleep came fitfully, filled with dreams of massive shadows and haunting whistles that echoed through endless corridors of pine trees. The next morning brought a phone call that changed everything. "Mr. Turner, this is Deputy Hanson with the Shoshone County Sheriff's Department. I understand you were camping up near Beaver Creek this past weekend." Michael's coffee mug froze halfway to his lips. "Yes, that's right. Is there a problem?" "Well, we've had some reports of unusual activity in that area, and I was hoping you might have seen something that could help us out. Did you notice anything strange while you were up there?" The deputy's voice was professional, but carried an undertone of genuine concern that made Michael's skin crawl. "What kind of activity?" "A family camping about 5 miles from where you were found. Their tent completely destroyed Sunday morning, shredded like tissue paper, gear scattered everywhere. They're claiming something attacked their campsite during the night, something they couldn't identify. Most of their story doesn't make much sense, but the physical evidence is concerning." Michael set down his coffee mug with shaking hands. "Was anyone hurt?" "Minor injuries, mostly from running through the woods in the dark. But here's the thing that's got us puzzled, Mr. Turner. They described hearing whistling sounds before the attack, like signals being passed back and forth through the forest. You didn't happen to hear anything like that, did you?" The phone felt slippery in Michael's sweaty palm. He could lie, claim he'd experienced nothing unusual, and probably never hear from law enforcement again. But something in the deputy's tone suggested this wasn't an isolated incident, and other people might be in danger if he stayed silent. "Actually, yes," Michael said quietly. "I did hear whistling. And some other things." Deputy Hanson's voice sharpened with interest. "Would you be willing to come in and give us a formal statement? We're trying to piece together a timeline of events, and any information you can provide might be helpful." Michael agreed to meet at the sheriff's office that afternoon, though he spent the rest of the morning second-guessing his decision. Talking to law enforcement meant making his experience official, part of the public record. It also meant opening himself up to skepticism and ridicule from people who'd never experienced anything outside their comfortable, rational worldview. The Shoshone County Sheriff's Department occupied a modern building on the outskirts of Kellogg, surrounded by parking lots and strip malls that epitomize small-town America. Deputy Hanson turned out to be a soft-spoken man in his 40s, with graying hair and the weathered complexion of someone who spent a lot of time outdoors. His office was cramped but organized, the walls covered with maps of the county and photographs of outdoor recreation areas. "I appreciate you coming in, Mr. Turner," Hanson said as he gestured for Michael to take a seat. "Let me start by saying that nothing you tell me here is going to end up in the newspapers. We're trying to understand what's happening up in those mountains, and we need honest accounts from reliable witnesses." Michael felt some of his tension ease. "I'm not sure how reliable my account is, Deputy. Some of what I experienced doesn't make much sense to me either." "That's fine. Just tell me what happened in your own words, and we'll sort out the details later." Michael began with his arrival at the campsite and the unnatural silence that had first alerted him something was wrong. Deputy Hanson listened without interruption, occasionally making notes on a yellow legal pad. His expression remained neutral throughout Michael's description of the strange smells, the circling sounds, and the massive shadow cast on his tent wall. When Michael described the damaged tree with its high gouges, Hansen leaned forward with obvious interest. "You said the marks started about 7 feet off the ground. At least, probably closer to 8 feet. And they were wide, like fingers, but much bigger than any human hand." Hansen made a note and continued listening. Michael finished his account with the whistling sounds and his hasty retreat, then sat back in his chair feeling emotionally drained. Reliving the experience had been more difficult than he'd expected, bringing back the primal fear he'd felt in the darkness. "Mr. Turner, I'm going to ask you a question, and I want you to think carefully before you answer," Hansen said. "Based on what you saw and heard, what do you think was out there with you?" Michael had been dreading this moment, the point where he'd have to voice the impossible conclusion his mind had been avoiding. "I don't know," he said slowly. "It wasn't any animal I'm familiar with, and I've been hunting these mountains for 20 years. It was too big, too coordinated, too intelligent, I guess. But it couldn't have been human either." Hansen nodded, as if this was exactly the answer he'd expected. The family that was attacked, the Johnsons, they described something very similar. A creature walking upright but much larger than a person, with an overwhelming smell and the ability to move through the forest almost silently. "Do you believe them?" "I believe they experienced something that scared them badly enough to leave behind $5,000 worth of camping gear and drive straight to the hospital. Mrs. Johnson is still under sedation for severe anxiety, and their 12-year-old son won't sleep without the lights on. People don't fake that kind of trauma." Hansen opened a file folder and pulled out several photographs, spreading them across his desk for Michael to see. These were taken at their campsite Sunday morning. The images made Michael's stomach turn. What had once been a family camping area looked like a war zone. A large tent had been reduced to tatters, its fabric strips hanging from nearby trees like gruesome streamers. Sleeping bags had been torn open, their synthetic fillings scattered across the ground like snow. Cooking equipment lay twisted and broken, as if something incredibly strong had vented its rage on every human artifact it could find. "The interesting thing," Hansen continued, "is what wasn't damaged. All the food was left untouched. If this was a bear attack, you'd expect the animal to be attracted to anything edible. Instead, it seems like something deliberately targeted the human presence itself." Michael studied the photographs more closely, noting the methodical nature of the destruction. "It looks like whatever did this was angry." That's exactly how Mrs. Johnson described it. She said it sounded furious, like they'd invaded its territory and it was determined to drive them out permanently. Hansen gathered up the photographs and returned them to the folder. "Mr. Turner, I need to ask you not to discuss this with anyone else for the time being. We're still investigating, and premature publicity could compromise our efforts. Are you going to close that area to camping?" "No. We're considering it, but we need more evidence first. The Forest Service is reluctant to shut down recreational areas based on unsubstantiated reports, and I can't say I blame them. Tourism is important to the local economy." Michael understood the political complications, but felt a chill at the thought of other unsuspecting campers encountering whatever was living in those mountains. What if there are more attacks? "That's exactly what we're trying to prevent," Hansen said grimly, "which is why accounts like yours are so important. The more we understand about this thing's behavior, the better we can protect the public." Michael left the sheriff's office with more questions than answers and a growing sense that his weekend camping trip had been just the beginning of something much larger and more dangerous. The drive back to his apartment took him through the heart of Coeur d'Alene, past tourists and locals going about their normal daily routines, completely unaware that something unknown was stalking the forests just a few miles away. That evening, Michael called his brother David in Seattle to talk through his experience with someone he trusted. David listened patiently to the entire story, asking thoughtful questions, but offering no judgment about the more incredible aspects of Michael's account. "So, what are you going to do now?" David asked when Michael finished. "I honestly don't know. Part of me wants to pretend it never happened and find somewhere else to hunt. But I keep thinking about what Deputy Hansen said, about other people potentially being in danger. You did the right thing talking to the police. Let them handle it from here." "I'm not sure they know how to handle something like this," Michael said. "Hansen seems like a good guy, but how do you investigate something that shouldn't exist?" "Maybe you should talk to someone who specializes in this kind of thing." Michael laughed bitterly. "You mean like those cryptozoology nuts on TV? Come on, David. I'm trying to stay grounded here. I'm not talking about television personalities. I mean serious researchers, people with scientific credentials who study unexplained phenomena. There's got to be someone out there who takes a rational approach to this stuff." After they hung up, Michael spent several hours searching the internet for information about similar encounters in the Pacific Northwest. What he found disturbed him more than he'd expected. Hundreds of reports stretched back decades, describing creatures that matched what he'd experienced in remarkable detail. The consistency of the accounts was unsettling, particularly the descriptions of intelligence and coordinated behavior that went far beyond normal animal activity. Most of the reports came from credible witnesses, experienced hunters, park rangers, and outdoor professionals who had reputations to protect. These weren't sensationalized tabloid stories, but sober accounts from people who clearly struggled with the implications of what they'd witnessed. Many described the same reluctance Michael felt to go public with their experiences, the fear of ridicule that kept them silent for years. 3 days later, Michael's truck was ready for pickup. Bill had replaced the damaged hoses and flushed the cooling system, restoring the vehicle to perfect working condition. As Michael paid the repair bill, Bill mentioned that several other hunters had experienced mechanical problems after camping in the same general area. "Strangest thing I've seen in 30 years, Bill said, shaking his head. "It's like that whole section of forest is cursed or something. Trucks that have run perfectly for years, suddenly developing problems, equipment failures that make no sense. I'm starting to think there's something in the water up there." Michael wondered if the equipment failures were really coincidental or if they represented another aspect of encounters with the unknown creature. Perhaps it possessed some ability to interfere with mechanical devices, or maybe the stress of close proximity to something so alien caused humans to make mistakes that led to accidents and breakdowns. Over the following weeks, Michael found himself obsessively following news reports from the region, looking for any mention of unusual incidents or animal attacks. The Johnson family's experience had apparently been hushed up, with no media coverage despite the dramatic nature of their encounter. Either the authorities were keeping the story quiet, or the family had chosen not to publicize their ordeal. Michael's sleep patterns remained disrupted, plagued by recurring nightmares that featured massive shadows and haunting whistles. He'd wake in the middle of the night with his heart pounding, convinced he could smell that distinctive musky odor that had first alerted him to the creature's presence. The rational part of his mind knew he was safe in his apartment, but his nervous system hadn't gotten the message. He found himself avoiding the outdoors entirely, something that would have been unthinkable just a month earlier. Hiking trails he'd walked dozens of times now seemed threatening and unpredictable. The familiar forests of northern Idaho had been transformed in his mind from a refuge into a potential hunting ground for something that defied explanation. 2 weeks after his encounter, Michael received another call from Deputy Hansen. "Mr. Turner, I wanted to update you on our investigation. We've had 3 more incidents in the same general area, all following a similar pattern. Campers reporting strange sounds, damaged equipment, and sightings of something large moving through the forest. Michael's grip tightened on the phone. Anyone hurt? Not seriously, but that might be changing. Last night we had a report from a group of college students who claimed something threw rocks at their camp. Big rocks, the size of bowling balls, thrown with enough force to dent their truck. They packed up and left immediately, but one of them got video footage on his phone. Michael's heart rate accelerated. Video of the creature? No, just the aftermath. But it shows the damage, and I have to admit it's compelling evidence that something unusual is happening up there. The Forest Service is finally taking our concerns seriously. Are they going to close the area? Temporarily, yes. They're posting signs restricting access to the Beaver Creek drainage, pending a wildlife investigation. It's not a permanent solution, but it should keep people safe while we figure out what we're dealing with. Michael felt a mixture of relief and unease. Protecting the public was obviously the right decision, but he couldn't shake the feeling that restricting human access might just allow whatever was out there to expand its territory and become bolder in its interactions with people. Deputy Hansen, can I ask you a personal question? Do you believe this thing is real? There was a long pause before Hansen answered. Mr. Turner, I've been in law enforcement for 18 years. I've investigated everything from domestic disputes to murder cases, and I've learned to separate fact from fiction pretty effectively. Based on the physical evidence we've collected and the consistency of witness accounts, I believe something is definitely out there, whether it's an unknown species of animal, some kind of hybrid, or something else entirely, I can't say. But it's real, and it's dangerous. After hanging up, Michael made a decision that surprised even himself. Instead of feeling relieved that the authorities were taking action, he found himself planning a return trip to the mountains. Not to the restricted area around Beaver Creek, but to other locations in the region where similar encounters had been reported. The rational part of his mind screamed that this was insane, but a deeper compulsion drove him forward. He needed answers. Michael spent the next few days researching historical accounts and gathering equipment for what he thought of as an investigation, rather than a hunting trip. This time, he brought a high-definition video camera, a digital audio recorder, and a GPS device for precise location tracking. If he encountered the creature again, he was determined to document it properly. His chosen destination was a remote area near the Montana border, about 60 miles from his original camping spot. Reports from this region described similar phenomena: unexplained sounds, equipment failures, and sightings of large bipedal creatures moving through the forest. The location was accessible by Forest Service roads, but far enough from civilization to discourage casual visitors. Michael established his new camp on a Saturday afternoon, choosing a site that offered good visibility in all directions while remaining concealed enough to avoid attracting unwanted attention. He set up multiple cameras around the perimeter, each equipped with motion sensors and infrared capability for night filming. His audio equipment ran continuously, recording even the slightest sounds for later analysis. The first night passed without incident. Normal forest sounds returned gradually as the local wildlife became accustomed to his presence. Michael heard owls calling in the distance, the rustle of small animals moving through the underbrush, and the occasional crack of settling wood. It was exactly what he'd expected from a healthy ecosystem, a stark contrast to the oppressive silence he'd experienced at Beaver Creek. By the second evening, Michael was beginning to question his decision to return to the mountains. Perhaps his original encounter had been nothing more than a chance meeting with a confused bear or an escaped exotic animal. Maybe the subsequent reports were the result of copycat hysteria, people convincing themselves they'd seen something extraordinary because they'd heard similar stories from others. That's when the whistling started again. It began just after sunset, a single clear note that seemed to come from the ridge above his camp. Michael's blood turned to ice as he recognized the distinctive sound that had haunted his dreams for weeks. He quickly checked his recording equipment, making sure everything was functioning properly, then settled back to wait with his rifle across his knees. The whistle was answered from across the valley, then again from a location much closer to his camp. As before, the sounds seemed to be signals passed between multiple individuals, a form of communication that suggested intelligence and coordination far beyond normal animal behavior. Michael forced himself to remain calm and focused, determined to document whatever was about to happen. A new sound joined the whistling, a rhythmic thumping that echoed through the forest like a giant's heartbeat. Michael recognized it immediately as the same tree-striking behavior he'd heard during his first encounter. Something was using the forest itself as a percussion instrument, creating sounds that could travel for miles through the mountains. The thumping grew closer and more frequent, accompanied now by the crashing of something large moving through heavy brush. Michael raised his video camera and panned it slowly across the tree line, hoping to catch a glimpse of whatever was approaching his camp. The infrared display showed heat signatures of small animals fleeing the area, but nothing large enough to account for the sounds he was hearing. A rock sailed out of the darkness and landed 10 feet from his tent. It was roughly the size of a softball, hurled with enough force to embed itself several inches into the soft forest floor. Michael swung his camera toward the direction it had come from, but saw nothing except empty darkness. He was reaching for his flashlight when a second rock whistled past his head, missing by inches. "I'm armed," Michael shouted into the darkness, his voice cracking with fear. "Stay back." His warning was answered by a sound that made his skin crawl, a deep, rumbling vocalization that seemed to combine elements of a roar, a growl, and something almost human. It lasted for nearly 10 seconds, dropping in pitch until Michael could feel it vibrating in his chest. No animal he knew made sounds like that. More rocks began to rain down on his camp, some as large as bowling balls, thrown with terrifying accuracy. One struck his truck with a metallic clang that echoed through the forest. Another shredded his tent wall, sending him diving for cover behind a fallen log. The barrage continued for several minutes, each impact precise enough to suggest the thrower could see perfectly in the darkness. Michael crouched behind his improvised shelter, clutching his rifle and trying to make sense of what was happening. This wasn't random animal aggression, but a coordinated attack designed to drive him away. Whatever was out there understood the concept of psychological warfare, using intimidation tactics that would be effective against a thinking opponent. The rock throwing stopped as suddenly as it had begun, replaced by a silence so complete that Michael could hear his own heartbeat. He waited several minutes before cautiously raising his head above the log, scanning the darkness for any sign of movement. His video camera lay smashed near his tent, its LCD screen flickering with electronic death throes. A footstep sounded directly behind him. Michael spun around, bringing his rifle up, but nothing was there except empty forest. The footstep had been clear and distinct, the sound of something heavy stepping on dry leaves, but his flashlight beam revealed no tracks or disturbance in the vegetation. It was as if his stalker possessed the ability to move without leaving any physical trace. Another footstep came from his left, then another from his right. Michael realized with growing horror that whatever was out there was playing with him, demonstrating its ability to approach unseen from any direction. He was being toyed with like a mouse by a cat, allowed to think he might escape, while being herded exactly where his tormentor wanted him to go. Michael made a desperate decision. Instead of waiting passively for whatever was coming, he would take the initiative and try to break through the invisible net that seemed to be closing around him. He sprinted toward his truck, crashing through underbrush and leaping over fallen logs in his haste to reach safety. He was halfway to the vehicle when something stepped out of the shadows directly in front of him. Michael's flashlight beam illuminated the creature for perhaps 3 seconds before his mind simply refused to process what he was seeing. It stood at least 9 feet tall, covered in dark hair that seemed to absorb light rather than reflect it. The body was massively built, but clearly bipedal, with shoulders broader than any human and arms that hung nearly to its knees. The face was the worst part, combining human and ape features in a way that triggered every primitive fear circuit in Michael's brain. The creature's eyes reflected his flashlight beam like glowing coals, fixed on him with an intelligence that was unmistakably aware and malevolent. It made no sound, simply stood blocking his path while radiating an aura of menace that made Michael's legs turn to water. For a moment that lasted an eternity, predator and prey regarded each other across 10 feet of forest floor. Then the creature opened its mouth and screamed. The sound was unlike anything Michael had ever heard, a vocalization that combined rage, dominance, and something almost like speech. It went on, echoing through the mountains and causing every bird and small animal within miles to flee in terror. Michael's rifle fell from his numb fingers as the sound drove all rational thought from his mind, leaving only the desperate need to escape. He turned and ran blindly through the forest, crashing through vegetation and stumbling over obstacles he couldn't see. Behind him, he could hear the creature giving chase, its footsteps creating small earthquakes as it bounded effortlessly through terrain that nearly killed Michael with every step. Branches tore at his clothing and face, but he felt no pain, only the overwhelming imperative to put distance between himself and the nightmare pursuing him. Michael burst out of the tree line onto a logging road he didn't remember seeing before, his lungs burning and his legs threatening to collapse. The creature's footsteps had stopped, but he didn't dare look back to see if it was still following. He ran along the gravel road until he spotted headlights in the distance, then began waving his arms frantically to flag down the approaching vehicle. The pickup truck screeched to a halt, and a grizzled logger in a flannel shirt leaned out the window with concern written across his weathered face. "Jesus, buddy, what happened to you? You look like you've seen a ghost." Michael climbed into the passenger seat with shaking hands, his entire body trembling from adrenaline and exhaustion. "Something attacked my camp," he managed to gasp. "I need to get out of here." The logger, who introduced himself as Pete, didn't ask for details during the 20-minute drive to the nearest town. Michael spent the trip staring out the rear window, half expecting to see glowing eyes following them along the dark road. Only when they reached the lights of civilization did he begin to feel his heart rate return to normal. Pete dropped him off at a motel on the outskirts of Libby, Montana, and offered to call the authorities if Michael wanted to report the incident. Michael declined, knowing that his story would sound insane without any physical evidence to support it. His camera was destroyed, his audio equipment abandoned at the campsite, along with the rest of his gear. All he had was another impossible account of an encounter with something that officially didn't exist. The motel room felt like a sanctuary after the horrors of the forest. Michael double-locked the door, drew the curtains, and spent most of the night sitting in a chair facing the window. Every sound from the parking lot made him jump, convinced that somehow the creature had followed him into town. Sleep came only in brief snatches, filled with nightmares of glowing eyes and inhuman screams. Morning brought a call from Deputy Hansen, who had somehow tracked Michael down despite his attempts to remain anonymous. "Mr. Turner, we found your campsite. I need you to tell me exactly what happened up there." Michael's heart sank as he realized the authorities had discovered the scene of his latest encounter. "How did you find me?" "The logger who picked you up called it in. He was concerned about your condition and thought you might need medical attention. Michael, your campsite looks like a bomb went off. What the hell happened?" Michael closed his eyes, knowing that his life was about to become infinitely more complicated. The same thing that happened to the Johnson family, only worse. It knew I was there specifically to document it, and it didn't appreciate the attention. Are you hurt? Not physically, but I lost all my equipment. Camera, audio recorder, everything. I don't have any proof of what I saw. Hansen's voice carried a note of frustration. Proof isn't your job, Mr. Turner. Your job is to stay alive and help us understand what we're dealing with. Can you meet me back here in Coeur d'Alene? We need to debrief you properly and figure out our next move. The drive back to Idaho gave Michael time to think about his situation and the larger implications of what was happening in the mountains. 2 direct encounters with the same creature suggested it was either territorial, about a specific area, or specifically targeting him for some reason. The escalation from passive observation to active aggression indicated that human presence was becoming increasingly intolerable to whatever was out there. Deputy Hansen met him at the sheriff's office with a federal wildlife agent named Dr. Sarah Chen, a young woman with advanced degrees in zoology and cryptozoology who had been called in to consult on the case. Dr. Chen listened to Michael's account with the kind of professional attention he'd been hoping for, asking detailed questions about the creature's behavior and physical characteristics. Based on your description, this entity displays several behaviors consistent with territorial defense, Doctor. Chen explained when Michael finished his story. The rock-throwing, vocalizations, and pursuit are all classic intimidation tactics used by large primates to establish dominance and drive off perceived threats. But you're talking about it like it's a known species, Michael said. This thing is 9 feet tall and built like a linebacker. What kind of primate gets that big? Gigantopithecus blacki was a species of extinct ape that could reach heights of 10 feet and weigh over 1,000 pounds. Dr. Chen replied. Fossil evidence suggests they survived until relatively recently in evolutionary terms, maybe as little as 100,000 years ago. It's not impossible that a relic population could have survived in isolated mountain regions. Michael felt a chill as he realized the implications of what she was suggesting. You think this is some kind of living fossil? I think we're dealing with an unknown species of large primate, yes. Whether it's a descendant of Gigantopithecus or represents a completely separate evolutionary branch, I can't say without physical evidence. But the behavioral patterns you've described are consistent with an intelligent, territorial animal that views humans as a threat to its habitat. Deputy Hansen leaned forward in his chair. Dr. Chen, if this thing is as aggressive as Mr. Turner describes, how do we protect the public without launching a full-scale military operation? Education and avoidance, Doctor, Chen replied. Most animal attacks occur when humans accidentally corner or threaten the animal. If we can identify this creature's territory and establish clear boundaries, we might be able to coexist peacefully. Michael thought about the intelligence he'd seen in those glowing eyes and shook his head. I don't think it's interested in coexistence. Both times I encountered it, it seemed determined to drive me away permanently. It's not just defending territory, it's actively hunting humans who enter its domain. That would be highly unusual behavior for a primate, Doctor, Chen said, but her tone suggested she was taking his concern seriously. Most apes avoid human contact whenever possible. Maybe most apes haven't been pushed to the edge of extinction by human expansion, Michael replied. If there are only a few of these things left, they might view any human presence as an existential threat. The meeting ended with plans for Dr. Chen to examine the physical evidence from Michael's destroyed campsite and coordinate with federal authorities on a broader investigation. Michael was asked to remain available for consultation, but warned against any further attempts to seek out the creature on his own. Over the following days, Michael tried to return to his normal routine, but found concentration impossible. His work as the electrical contractor suffered as he repeatedly lost focus during conversations with clients and made basic mistakes he'd never made before. Sleep remained elusive, broken by recurring nightmares and a persistent feeling that he was being watched even in his locked apartment. The phone rang constantly with calls from Dr. Chen, Deputy Hansen, and various federal agencies that had become involved in the investigation. Each conversation required Michael to relive his encounters in excruciating detail, answering the same questions over and over while officials tried to establish a coherent picture of what they were dealing with. A week after his second encounter, Michael received a call that changed everything once again. Dr. Chen's voice carried an urgency he hadn't heard before. "Michael, we found something at your campsite that we missed during the initial investigation. A fragment of organic material caught on a broken branch, probably left behind when the creature was throwing rocks. We've sent it for DNA analysis, and the preliminary results are unusual." Michael's pulse quickened. Unusual how? The genetic markers are definitely primate, but they don't match any known species. This thing is either a completely unknown animal or represents a genetic lineage we thought went extinct thousands of years ago. Either way, it's the discovery of the century. The weight of that revelation settled over Michael like a suffocating blanket. His weekend hunting trip had accidentally uncovered evidence of a species that could rewrite textbooks and challenge humanity's understanding of its place in the natural world. The implications were staggering, but so was the responsibility that came with such knowledge. "What happens now?" Michael asked. "Now we have to decide how much of this to make public, Doctor," Chen replied. "There are already rumors circulating in the scientific community, and it's only a matter of time before the media gets wind of the story. We need to be prepared for the circus that's coming." Michael thought about the peaceful mountains where he'd hunted for most of his life, soon to be overrun by reporters, tourists, and thrill-seekers looking for their own encounter with the unknown. The creature that had terrorized him would become the most famous animal on Earth, its habitat destroyed by the very attention meant to protect it. "Dr. Chen, I have one request. When this story breaks, I want to remain anonymous. I've seen enough of that thing to last a lifetime, and I don't need the whole world knowing about my involvement." "I understand, and I'll do my best to honor that request. But Michael, you should know that your encounters may have saved lives. If this creature had continued expanding its territory unchecked, eventually someone would have been seriously injured or killed. Your reports allowed us to establish protective measures before that happened." After ending the call, Michael sat alone in his apartment and tried to process the magnitude of what his simple hunting trip had unleashed. Outside his window, Coeur d'Alene continued its peaceful existence, unaware that proof of an unknown species had been discovered just a few miles away in the mountains that formed the town's scenic backdrop. The next morning brought the first news reports. Michael watched in growing dismay as television crews descended on the Shoshone County Sheriff's Department, and reporters breathlessly described the discovery of possible evidence of an unknown primate species in northern Idaho. The story spread across social media like wildfire, attracting attention from cryptozoologists, skeptics, and everyone in between. Within days, the quiet mountain roads Michael had traveled alone were clogged with RVS, tour buses, and cars bearing license plates from across the country. Local businesses found themselves overwhelmed with customers looking for guides, equipment, and any information about where they might have their own encounter with what the media had dubbed the Idaho Forest Giant. Michael watched the circus from a distance, grateful for his anonymity, but saddened by the transformation of his beloved wilderness into a tourist attraction. The Forest Service had expanded the restricted area and increased ranger patrols, but dozens of would-be cryptozoologists were arrested each week for trespassing in the closed zone. Then came the inevitable tragedy. 3 weeks after the DNA results were announced, a group of college students from Boise ignored the closure signs and hiked into the restricted area with camping gear and video equipment. They were found 2 days later by a search and rescue team, their camp destroyed, and one member of the group hospitalized with severe lacerations and psychological trauma. The injured student, a 20-year-old named Jason Miller, described an encounter that made Michael's experiences seem tame by comparison. According to Miller's account, given from his hospital bed in Coeur d'Alene, something had stalked their group for hours before attacking their camp with a fury that defied comprehension. "It wasn't an animal," Miller told reporters in a shaking voice. "It was something that hated us for being there, like we'd committed some unforgivable sin just by existing in its world. The sounds it made, they weren't natural. They were full of rage and intelligence and something else I can't even describe." Michael watched the interview from his living room and saw his own terror reflected in the young man's eyes. Miller would recover from his physical injuries, but the psychological scars would last forever. Michael knew exactly how that felt. The attack prompted immediate action from federal authorities. The National Guard was called in to establish a security perimeter around the entire region, and serious discussions began about declaring the area a permanent wildlife preserve with military-level protection. The creature that had once lived in peaceful isolation was now the most protected animal in North America, surrounded by an armed cordon that stretched for miles in every direction. Dr. Chen called to update Michael on the investigation's progress and to ask for his input on protective measures being considered by federal agencies. The conversation took place over secure phone lines, as if they were discussing classified military secrets rather than wildlife management. "The DNA analysis confirmed our initial findings," Dr. Chen reported. "This is definitely an unknown species, possibly the last remnant of a lineage that diverged from the human evolutionary tree millions of years ago. We're dealing with something that's essentially our cousin, but one that developed along a completely different path." Michael absorbed that information with mixed emotions. The creature that had terrorized him was apparently a distant relative, a fellow primate that shared common ancestors with all of humanity. That knowledge should have made it seem less alien and threatening, but somehow it only made the encounters more disturbing. "Have there been any more sightings?" Michael asked. "Several, but all from a distance and all in areas we've now evacuated. The entity seems to have withdrawn deeper into the mountains as human activity increased around its territory. We think it's avoiding contact now, that it associates humans with large numbers and military presence. So it's learned to be afraid of us. That would be the hope, yes. But Michael, there's something else you should know. The genetic analysis revealed that the sample we found came from a female. If there's a breeding population of these creatures, we might be dealing with a family group rather than a single individual." The implications of that revelation hit Michael like a physical blow. Everything he'd experienced might have been the protective behavior of a mother defending her offspring from perceived threats. The intelligence and coordination he'd witnessed could represent a family unit working together to drive humans away from their territory. "How many do you think there might be?" Michael asked. "Based on the size of the territory they seem to control and the resources required to sustain animals of this size, probably no more than a half-dozen individuals. They're apex predators living in an ecosystem that can only support a very small population. And they're all as territorial as the one I encountered? Probably more so now that they're under pressure from human encroachment. Michael, I want you to understand that what you experienced was likely a best-case scenario. If these creatures feel their survival is threatened, they might abandon defensive behavior in favor of aggressive action." Michael thanked Dr. Chen for the update and hung up with a growing sense of unease. The military cordon around the mountains might protect human visitors, but it also represented an escalation in the conflict between species. Sooner or later, the pressure would reach a breaking point, and Michael suspected the results would be catastrophic for both sides. His prediction proved accurate sooner than expected. 2 months after the first DNA results were announced, a series of incidents along the security perimeter suggested that the creatures were testing the human defenses, probing for weaknesses, with an intelligence that surprised everyone involved. Guard posts reported strange sounds in the night, equipment failures that couldn't be explained, and brief sightings of massive figures moving just beyond the range of infrared cameras. Then on a foggy November morning, one of the creatures broke through. Michael learned about the breach from a terse phone call from Deputy Hansen, who was coordinating local law enforcement's response to what was being described as a wildlife incident at a small town 20 miles from the restricted zone. 3 people had been injured during what witnesses described as an attack by something that matched descriptions of the Idaho forest giant. "We need you to look at something," Hansen said without preamble. "The scene is unusual, and we could use your expertise in understanding what we're dealing with." Michael arrived at the town of Fernwood to find it transformed into a military staging area. Humvees and personnel carriers lined the main street, while helicopters circled overhead in a constant patrol pattern. The actual incident site was a small gas station on the edge of town, now surrounded by yellow tape and guarded by soldiers with automatic weapons. Deputy Hansen met him at the perimeter and escorted him through the security cordon to where Dr. Chen was examining physical evidence with a team of federal investigators. The scene inside the gas station looked like the aftermath of a tornado, with shelving units overturned and merchandise scattered across the floor. "What happened here?" Michael asked, though the familiar pattern of destruction already suggested the answer. "Something came out of the woods around 5 this morning," Hansen explained. The night clerk heard noises outside and went to investigate. When he opened the door, he came face to face with what he described as a giant covered in dark fur. The creature didn't attack immediately, just stood there looking at him for several seconds, like it was trying to communicate. That's what the clerk thinks. He said it seemed curious rather than aggressive, like it was trying to understand what it was seeing. But when a customer pulled into the parking lot and got out of his car, everything changed. Hansen led Michael outside to examine the parking lot, where massive footprints were preserved in the soft earth. Each print was over 18 inches long and showed clear toe impressions, evidence of a bipedal creature with human-like feet, but proportions that suggested enormous size and weight. The creature apparently viewed the second human as a threat, Dr. Chen continued the story. It charged the customer, who barely managed to get back into his car. Then it turned its attention to the gas station itself, destroying everything it could reach through the windows and door. Michael studied the damage pattern and recognized the systematic nature of the destruction. This wasn't random vandalism, but a deliberate attempt to eliminate human presence from what the creature perceived as its territory. "Where is it now?" "Gone," Hansen replied grimly. "It disappeared back into the forest before our response teams arrived." But Michael, here's the thing that has everyone worried. This incident occurred 20 miles from the nearest edge of the restricted zone. Either this creature traveled much farther than we thought possible, or there are more of them than we realized. Dr. Chen looked up from her examination of the footprints with obvious concern. "The gait analysis suggests this was a different individual from the one that left the DNA sample. Based on size and foot shape, probably a male, and significantly larger than the female we identified from your campsite." Michael felt his blood turn cold as the implications became clear. "How much larger?" Based on the stride length and depth of these impressions, we're looking at something that could weigh 800 to 1,000 pounds and stand over 10 feet tall. This is an adult male in his prime, and he's clearly not intimidated by human presence. The investigation continued for several hours, but Michael found it difficult to concentrate as his mind processed what this escalation meant for everyone involved. A lone female defending her territory was one thing, but an adult male actively stalking human settlements represented a threat of an entirely different magnitude. That evening, Michael sat in his motel room watching news coverage of the incident and feeling a crushing sense of responsibility for everything that had followed his original camping trip. If he'd simply packed up and left without reporting his encounter to authorities, none of this would be happening. The creatures would have remained hidden. Humans would have stayed out of their territory, and both species could have coexisted in ignorance of each other. Instead, his decision to involve law enforcement had triggered a cascade of events that now threatened to spiral completely out of control. The scientific discovery of the century was becoming a potential species war, with military forces arrayed against intelligent creatures whose only crime was defending their ancestral homeland from human intrusion. Dr. Chen called that evening with more disturbing news. "Michael, we've detected seismic activity in the restricted zone that suggests large-scale movement of multiple individuals. Our monitoring equipment is picking up coordinated travel patterns that indicate these creatures are gathering in response to the increased human presence." Gathering for what? We're not sure, but the behavioral patterns are consistent with either a defensive strategy or preparation for coordinated action. Either way, it suggests a level of social organization and strategic thinking that makes them far more dangerous than we initially realized. Michael thought about the intelligence he'd seen in those glowing eyes during his encounters and wasn't surprised by Dr. Chen's assessment. These weren't simple animals driven by instinct, but thinking beings capable of planning and coordination. The question was whether they were planning defense or offense. The answer came 3 days later. Michael was awakened at dawn by his phone ringing with an emergency tone he'd never heard before. Deputy Hansen's voice carried a level of panic that made Michael's stomach clench with dread. "Michael, we need you at the command center immediately. They've made their move." Michael dressed quickly and drove through streets filled with emergency vehicles rushing toward the mountains. The radio carried reports of coordinated attacks on military positions around the perimeter, synchronized assaults that had caught the defenders completely off guard. Several guard posts had been overrun, their personnel missing, and their equipment destroyed with the same systematic thoroughness Michael had witnessed at the gas station. The command center was in chaos when Michael arrived, with officers shouting orders and radio traffic describing a military situation unlike anything in modern American experience. The creatures had somehow coordinated an attack across a front that stretched for dozens of miles, striking multiple targets simultaneously before disappearing back into the forest. "How many casualties?" Michael asked Hansen, who was coordinating local law enforcement response to the crisis. "Unknown. We've lost contact with 6 different positions, and the survivors are reporting encounters with multiple individuals working together like a military unit. These things aren't just animals, Michael. They're conducting warfare." Dr. Chen appeared at Michael's side, her face pale and her voice shaking with stress. "Michael, we think they're specifically targeting human leadership. The attacks focused on command posts and communication centers, not random positions. They understand our command structure and they're trying to decapitate it." Michael absorbed this information with growing horror. The creatures had been observing human activity around their territory for months, learning how the military forces were organized and identifying weak points in the defenses. Now they were using that knowledge to conduct precision strikes that would maximize disruption while minimizing their own exposure. "What's the plan?" Michael asked. "Right now, we're in full retreat," Hansen admitted. "The federal authorities are pulling back to defensible positions and calling in reinforcements. But Michael, they want to talk to you about negotiation." Negotiation? These creatures are clearly intelligent enough for complex planning and coordination. If they can understand military tactics, maybe they can understand diplomacy. You're the only person who's had extended contact with them and survived. They want to know if you think communication is possible. Michael thought about his encounters with the creature, remembering the intelligence in its eyes and the way it had seemed to study him during their confrontations. There had definitely been awareness there, a recognition that it was dealing with another thinking being rather than a simple animal. But there had also been unmistakable hostility, a determination to drive him away that seemed absolute and non-negotiable. "I don't think they're interested in sharing," Michael said finally. "Both times I encountered them, the message was clear: leave and don't come back. I think they view humans as an existential threat that needs to be eliminated from their territory." "But surely they understand they can't win a war against the United States military, Doctor." Chen protested. Michael looked at the chaos around them, the confused officers and conflicting radio reports, and shook his head. "I don't think they're trying to win a war. I think they're trying to make the cost of staying so high that we'll choose to leave voluntarily." His assessment proved accurate over the following days, as the conflict settled into a pattern of guerrilla warfare that favored the creature's superior knowledge of the terrain and their ability to move unseen through the forest. Military forces found themselves fighting an enemy that struck without warning and vanished before retaliation was possible, an enemy that seemed to anticipate their movements and counter their strategies with disturbing efficiency. Public opinion began to turn against the military operation as casualty reports mounted and no progress was made toward resolving the situation. Protesters gathered outside the Pentagon, demanding an end to what they called an ecological genocide, while others demanded more aggressive action to eliminate what they saw as a threat to human dominance. Michael watched the coverage from his apartment, now under federal protection due to his status as a key witness in what was being called the most significant contact event in human history. His role in discovering the creatures had made him both famous and infamous, with some groups hailing him as a hero while others blamed him for triggering the conflict. The phone calls from reporters, book agents, and movie producers never stopped, but Michael refused all interviews and appearances. He'd seen enough of the creatures to last several lifetimes, and he had no desire to profit from what had become a genuine tragedy for both species involved. 3 weeks into the conflict, Dr. Chen called with news that changed everything once again. "Michael, we've detected something unusual in the behavioral patterns. The attacks have stopped, and our monitoring equipment is showing movement away from human positions toward the deepest parts of the restricted zone. We think they're withdrawing." "Withdrawing where?" "There's a system of caves in the most remote part of their territory, natural formations that extend deep underground. Our geological surveys suggest some of the passages could go down for miles, connecting to underground river systems that stretch across multiple mountain ranges." Michael felt a chill as he realized what Dr. Chen was suggesting. "You think they're going underground permanently?" "It's possible. If they've concluded that coexistence with humans is impossible, they might choose to retreat to a habitat where we can't follow them. The cave systems could provide everything they need to survive while remaining completely hidden from human contact." The implications were staggering. An intelligent species choosing to abandon the surface world rather than share it with humanity, retreating to a subterranean existence that would effectively make them extinct from a human perspective. It would be the ultimate victory for human expansion, the complete elimination of competition for territorial control. but it would also represent the loss of a unique evolutionary branch, the disappearance of humanity's closest relatives, and potentially the only other sapient species on Earth. The scientific and philosophical implications of such a loss were incalculable. "Is there any way to prevent it?" Michael asked. "Not without fundamentally changing human behavior toward wilderness preservation and territorial sharing. And frankly, Michael, I'm not sure that's possible. Look at how quickly this situation escalated from scientific discovery to military conflict. Human nature doesn't seem compatible with coexistence when it comes to territorial disputes." Michael ended the call feeling a profound sense of loss for what might have been. Under different circumstances, contact between the species could have been a magnificent achievement, opening new frontiers in understanding intelligence, evolution, and humanity's place in the natural world. Instead, it had become a tragedy of miscommunication and mutual fear that was ending with the voluntary extinction of Earth's most remarkable creatures. The official end of the conflict came 6 months later, when federal authorities declared the restricted zone safe for limited human access. No creatures had been detected for weeks, and extensive searches of the cave systems revealed evidence of recent habitation, but no current occupants. The underground passages extended far beyond the reach of human exploration, disappearing into geological formations that would remain inaccessible for decades or centuries to come. Michael returned to the mountains one final time, drawn by a need to see the place where everything had begun. The forest around Beaver Creek looked exactly as it had during his original camping trip, with no visible signs of the dramatic events that had unfolded there. Birds sang in the trees, squirrels chattered from the branches, and the normal sounds of a healthy ecosystem had returned. But something was different. The feeling of being watched, which had been so strong during his encounters with the creatures, was completely absent. The forest felt empty in a way that went beyond the normal absence of large predators. It felt like a place where something important had been lost forever. Michael made camp in the same clearing where he'd first heard the whistling sounds that had changed his life. He spent the night beside his fire, listening to the familiar sounds of the wilderness and trying to process everything that had happened since his last visit to this spot. The creatures were gone, disappeared into the depths of the earth like a myth reversing itself, and he was left with nothing but memories of glowing eyes and inhuman intelligence. As dawn broke over the mountains, Michael packed his gear and prepared to leave the forest for the last time. He'd lost his love for wilderness camping, his sense of peace in the wild places contaminated by the knowledge of what had once shared these spaces with humanity. The mountains would always remind him of the brief moment when two intelligent species had stood face to face on Earth, and the tragic failure of imagination that had made coexistence impossible. The drive back to civilization took him past the closed research stations and abandoned military positions that marked the boundaries of what had once been the most militarized wilderness area in North America. Signs warned visitors away from unstable ground and dangerous wildlife, but Michael knew the real danger was gone forever, retreated to a realm where humans would never again threaten its existence. Dr. Chen called him one final time as he reached the edge of Coeur d'Alene, her voice carrying a sadness that matched his own. "Michael, I wanted you to know that the scientific community has voted to classify the DNA evidence as inconclusive. Officially, there's no proof that an unknown species was ever discovered in the Idaho mountains." Michael wasn't surprised by the decision. The political and social implications of admitting that humanity had driven another intelligent species into hiding were too enormous for any government to acknowledge. It was easier to classify the entire incident as mass hysteria combined with misidentified wildlife, to pretend that nothing extraordinary had ever happened. What about the physical evidence? The footprints, the DNA, the video footage? Lost contaminated, or explained away as hoaxes. Within a few years, the whole story will be nothing more than another cryptozoology legend, dismissed by serious scientists and relegated to conspiracy websites. Michael thought about Jason Miller and the other witnesses whose lives had been forever changed by their encounters with the impossible. Their trauma would be real regardless of official acknowledgement, their nightmares persistent whether or not science accepted their experiences as valid. "Do you think they're still alive down there?" Michael asked. "I hope so, Doctor," Chen replied quietly. "I hope they found a way to build a new life in the deep places, away from human interference. And I hope someday we'll be wise enough to deserve another chance at contact." Michael hung up and drove through the streets of Coeur d'Alene, looking at the normal human activity around him with new eyes. People went about their daily routines completely unaware that they shared the planet with another intelligent species, one that had chosen exile over extinction in the face of human expansion. The secret would remain hidden, buried in classified files and protected by official denial, but Michael would carry the truth with him for the rest of his life. He returned to his apartment and his work as an electrical contractor, trying to rebuild a normal existence in a world that felt fundamentally changed. The nightmares gradually faded, replaced by dreams of glowing eyes watching from impossible distances and vast underground spaces where intelligence moved in darkness beyond human reach. Sometimes, late at night, Michael would find himself listening to the sounds outside his window and wondering if somewhere deep beneath the mountains, creatures that had once shared the surface world were listening too, remembering the brief and tragic moment when two species had almost learned to coexist. The official story claimed nothing had ever happened in the mountains of northern Idaho, but Michael Turner knew better, and the knowledge would haunt him until the day he died, a permanent reminder of humanity's greatest discovery and its most profound failure. The next case, the West Virginia encounter. Brian Cooper adjusted his grip on the Remington 700, feeling the familiar weight of the rifle settle against his shoulder. The October morning air cut through his orange hunting vest, carrying the earthy scent of decomposing leaves and the faint musk of deer trails that crisscrossed these West Virginia mountains. He'd been tracking this particular 8-point buck for 3 days, following its patterns through the dense hardwood forest that stretched endlessly beyond the small town of Helvetia. Something felt different today. Brian couldn't pinpoint exactly what bothered him as he crouched behind a fallen oak, watching the game trail that wound between towering maples and oaks. The forest seemed too quiet, not the peaceful quiet of a sleeping woodland, but the tense silence that settles when predators move through an area. Even the squirrels had stopped their incessant chattering. Brian had been hunting these mountains for 15 years, ever since his divorce had driven him from his apartment in Charleston to this isolated cabin his grandfather had left him. He knew every ridge, every hollow, every creek that carved through the limestone bedrock. He understood the rhythms of the forest, could read the subtle signs that most city hunters missed completely. But today, those instincts whispered warnings he couldn't interpret. The buck appeared at exactly 7:23 a.m., stepping cautiously from behind a cluster of mountain laurel. Brian held his breath, watching the magnificent animal test the air with its black nose, ears swiveling like radar dishes. The deer's muscles tensed beneath its gray-brown coat, ready to bolt at the slightest threat. Brian slowly raised the rifle, centering the crosshairs behind the animal's front shoulder. The shot echoed through the hollow like thunder, sending a flock of crows exploding from their roost in angry protest. The buck staggered, took 2 uncertain steps, then collapsed in a heap of antlers and twitching legs. Brian felt the familiar mixture of satisfaction and regret that followed every successful hunt. The animal had lived a good life in these mountains, and now it would feed his family through the winter. He waited 5 minutes before approaching, following his grandfather's advice about letting wounded animals settle. But this deer was clearly dead, its eyes already beginning to cloud over. Brian knelt beside the carcass, running his hand along the sleek fur. The bullet had taken it cleanly through both lungs. A quick, ethical kill. That's when he heard the first branch break. The sound came from somewhere behind him, deeper in the forest, where the trees grew so thick they blocked most of the morning sunlight. Not the sharp crack of a small branch under a squirrel's weight, but the deep groan of substantial wood giving way under significant pressure. Brian froze, his hand still resting on the deer's flank. Another branch snapped, closer this time, then another. Whatever was moving through those trees was large and making no effort to move quietly. Brian's first thought was bear. Black bears were common in these mountains, and a fresh deer kill would definitely attract their attention. But something about the sounds bothered him. Bears typically moved with more caution, especially during hunting season when the woods echoed with rifle shots. Brian stood slowly, unslinging his rifle from his shoulder. He carried 4 rounds in the magazine, more than enough to deal with an aggressive bear if necessary. The forest had fallen completely silent now, as if every living creature was holding its breath. A branch creaked somewhere to his left, but when Brian turned toward the sound, he saw nothing but shadows between the tree trunks. The hair on his arms began to stand up, some primitive alarm system inherited from ancestors who knew what it meant to be prey. He decided to field dress the deer quickly and get out of the area. Whatever was watching him could have the scraps. Brian had learned long ago to trust his instincts in the wilderness, and right now those instincts were screaming at him to leave. He pulled his hunting knife from its sheath and knelt beside the deer's hindquarters. The blade was razor sharp, honed to perfection the night before. Brian had performed this ritual hundreds of times, could gut and skin a deer in under 30 minutes. But as he positioned the knife for the first incision, another sound froze his blood. A low rumble, somewhere between a growl and a moan, drifted through the trees. It didn't sound like any animal Brian had ever encountered. Too deep for a coyote, too guttural for a bear, too organic for machinery. The sound seemed to come from everywhere and nowhere, bouncing off the tree trunks until Brian couldn't determine its source. He gripped the rifle tighter, thumb finding the safety. His mouth had gone completely dry. Every nerve in his body urged him to run, but 25 years of military training and 15 years of hunting these mountains held him in place. Running from an unknown threat was often the worst possible strategy. The rumbling stopped as abruptly as it had begun. Brian counted his heartbeats, listening for any sound that might reveal what was watching him. 1 beat, 2, 3. On the 4th beat, something massive crashed through the underbrush behind him. Brian spun around, rifle raised, but saw only swaying branches marking the passage of whatever had just thundered past. Leaves and broken twigs rained down from the disturbed canopy. The crash hadn't sounded like a charging animal, more like something running away, crashing through the forest in apparent panic. But that made no sense. What could be large enough to make that much noise, yet scared enough to flee from a lone hunter? Brian's hands were shaking now, adrenaline flooding his system without any clear target for his fight-or-flight response. He forced himself to breathe slowly, trying to think logically about what he'd heard. Probably just a spooked bear, maybe one that had never encountered a human before. The gunshot could have disoriented it, sent it blundering through the woods in confusion. He turned back to the deer, determined to finish his work and get home. But as he knelt beside the carcass, Brian noticed something that made his stomach clench. The deer had been moved. When the animal had fallen, its head had been pointing uphill toward the game trail. Brian was certain of this detail because he'd specifically noted the position while waiting to approach. But now the deer lay with its head pointing downhill toward the creek that ran through the bottom of the hollow. Brian stared at the repositioned carcass, his mind struggling to process what he was seeing. A 180-pound deer didn't just flip itself around. Something had moved it while his attention was focused on the sounds in the forest. Something strong enough to reposition a dead deer without leaving any obvious signs of disturbance in the surrounding leaf litter. He circled the area carefully, looking for tracks or any other evidence of what had touched his kill. The forest floor was a thick carpet of fallen leaves, perfect for hiding footprints. But near the deer's original position, Brian found something that made his pulse quicken. A depression in the soft earth, partially hidden beneath scattered leaves. Brian brushed away the debris, revealing what looked like a partial footprint. But this print was unlike anything he'd ever seen. Nearly twice the length of his own size 11 boot, with what appeared to be distinct toe impressions. The depth of the impression suggested something incredibly heavy had made it. Brian had encountered bear tracks countless times during his years in these mountains. This wasn't a bear track. Bears left claw marks, and their paws had a distinctly different shape. This looked almost human, but scaled up to an impossible size. He fumbled for his cell phone, wanting to photograph the print before doing anything else. But when he pulled the device from his pocket, the screen remained black. The battery had been at 60% when he'd left his cabin that morning. Now it was completely dead. A chill ran down Brian's spine that had nothing to do with the October air. In 15 years of hunting these mountains, he'd never experienced anything like this. The repositioned deer, the massive footprint, the mysterious sounds, and now his phone dying without explanation. Each individual event could be explained away, but together they formed a pattern that defied rational explanation. Brian forced himself to focus on immediate priorities. He needed to get the Deerfield dressed and loaded into his truck before whatever had moved it decided to return. He could worry about explanations later from the safety of his cabin. But as he began cutting into the deer's abdomen, Brian became aware of a new smell drifting through the forest. A musky, organic odor that reminded him of the primate house at the Charleston Zoo, but infinitely stronger. The stench was so powerful it made his eyes water, a mixture of wet fur, rotting vegetation, and something else he couldn't identify. The smell grew stronger by the minute, as if its source was moving closer. Brian worked faster, his hands slick with blood and adrenaline sweat. He managed to remove the internal organs and began dragging the deer toward his truck, which was parked on an old logging road about 200 yards uphill. That's when he heard the breathing. Deep, rhythmic inhalations and exhalations that seemed to come from directly behind him. Brian dropped the deer and spun around, rifle ready, but saw nothing except trees and shadows. The breathing continued, slow and deliberate, like something large trying to catch his scent. Brian's mouth had gone completely dry. His hands trembled as he tried to pinpoint the source of the sound, but it seemed to move around him, sometimes to his left, sometimes behind him, sometimes so close he could almost feel the breath on his neck. "Who's there?" Brian called out, his voice cracking despite his efforts to sound authoritative. "I'm armed, and I know you're there." The breathing stopped instantly. The forest became so quiet that Brian could hear his own heartbeat thundering in his ears. He stood perfectly still, rifle raised, waiting for some response that never came. After what felt like an eternity, Brian heard a new sound that made his skin crawl. A low, clicking noise, like someone slowly running their fingernails across tree bark. The sound moved in a circle around his position, staying just out of sight, behind the thick tree trunks. Brian realized with growing horror that something was stalking him, not approaching directly like a curious animal, but deliberately circling, testing his defenses, looking for weaknesses. This was intelligent behavior, predatory behavior. No animal native to West Virginia hunted like this. He abandoned the deer carcass and began backing toward his truck, keeping the rifle trained on the forest around him. The clicking sounds followed, maintaining their distance but clearly tracking his movement. Branches rustled in his peripheral vision, but whenever Brian turned to look, he saw nothing. The 200 yards to his truck felt like 2 miles. Brian's legs shook with each step, his back muscles cramped from the constant tension of expecting an attack from behind. Sweat poured down his face despite the cool morning air. He could see his red pickup truck through the trees now, parked exactly where he'd left it on the narrow logging road. The sight of that familiar vehicle filled him with relief. Once he reached the truck, he could drive out of these mountains and try to make sense of what had just happened. But as Brian climbed the final slope toward the road, the clicking sounds suddenly stopped. The forest fell silent again, but this time the silence felt different, expectant, like the moment before a thunderstorm breaks. Brian reached his truck and yanked open the driver's door, throwing his rifle onto the passenger seat. His hands shook as he fumbled for his keys, finally finding them in his left jacket pocket. He jammed the key into the ignition and turned it. Nothing happened. Brian tried again, pumping the gas pedal. The engine turned over but wouldn't catch. On the third attempt, he heard only an impotent clicking from the starter. The truck's battery was dead, just like his cell phone. "No, no, no," Brian muttered, continuing to turn the key despite knowing it was useless. This truck had never given him any trouble. He'd driven it to the mountains hundreds of times without a single mechanical problem. A branch snapped somewhere behind the truck. Brian spun around in his seat, peering through the rear window. Something large moved between the trees, too quick for him to identify, but definitely there. His heart hammered against his ribs. Brian grabbed his rifle and climbed out of the truck, scanning the forest for whatever was stalking him. The trees seemed to lean in closer, their shadows deeper and more threatening than they had been just minutes earlier. He could smell that musky odor again, stronger now, making his stomach churn. Another branch broke, this time to his right, then another to his left. Brian realized with mounting terror that multiple somethings were surrounding him. He'd stumbled into some kind of trap, though he couldn't understand what kind of animal would demonstrate this level of coordination. A rock the size of a softball crashed through the trees and slammed into the side of his truck, leaving a significant dent in the red paint. Brian jerked toward the sound, but again saw nothing. Another rock followed, then another. Someone or something was throwing stones at him with incredible accuracy. "What do you want?" Brian shouted into the forest, his voice echoing off the surrounding ridges. "I'm leaving." "Just let me go." The rock throwing stopped, but Brian could sense movement all around him. Branches swayed without any wind to move them. Leaves rustled in patterns that suggested large bodies passing just out of sight. The musky smell had become overwhelming, making him gag with each breath. Brian decided to abandon the truck and try to reach the main road on foot. It was roughly 3 miles through the forest, but he knew these mountains well enough to navigate even without his GPS. Staying here was clearly not an option. He shouldered his rifle and began jogging down the logging road, trying to put distance between himself and whatever was surrounding his truck. The narrow road wound down the mountain in a series of switchbacks, carved into the hillside decades earlier by timber companies. But Brian had only traveled about 50 yards when he heard something that stopped him cold. The unmistakable sound of metal scraping against metal, coming from the direction of his truck. He turned back and saw something that defied every rational explanation his mind could construct. A massive, dark shape was bent over his pickup truck, apparently examining the vehicle with obvious intelligence. The creature stood at least 8 feet tall, covered in dark fur that seemed to absorb the dappled sunlight filtering through the canopy. Brian ducked behind a large oak tree, his heart pounding so hard he was sure the creature would hear it. He peered around the trunk, trying to process what he was seeing. The thing looked almost human in its posture and movements, but no human had ever stood that tall or moved with such obvious physical power. As Brian watched, the creature gripped the truck's front bumper with both hands and lifted the entire front end of the vehicle off the ground. 2 tons of metal rose into the air as easily as Brian might lift a cooler full of beer. The display of strength was so casual, so effortless, that Brian felt his legs go weak. The creature set the truck down and moved around to the driver's side, its massive head disappearing inside the cab. Brian could hear metal grinding and plastic snapping as the thing apparently dismantled something inside his vehicle. When the creature straightened up, it held Brian's truck battery in one enormous hand. The battery that had weighed 40 pounds when Brian had installed it just 6 months earlier looked like a toy in the thing's grasp. The creature examined the battery for a moment, then casually crushed it between its fingers. Acid and plastic fragments scattered across the ground. Brian's rifle felt pathetically inadequate against something that could crush car batteries with its bare hands. But as the creature turned in his direction, he got his first clear look at its face, and terror paralyzed every muscle in his body. The face was almost human, but stretched and distorted like something from a nightmare. Massive brow ridge, sunken eyes that reflected the forest light like an animal's, and a mouthful of yellowed teeth that belonged on something much larger than any primate. When those reflective eyes locked onto Brian's hiding place, he knew with absolute certainty that the creature had been aware of his presence all along. The thing that shouldn't exist straightened to its full height and let out a sound that Brian would never be able to adequately describe to anyone else. Part roar, part scream, part something else that bypassed his rational mind and spoke directly to genetic memories of being hunted by things far more dangerous than humans. Brian ran. He crashed through the forest like a madman, abandoning any attempt at stealth or strategy. Branches tore at his jacket and face. Roots tried to trip him with every step, but Brian didn't slow down. Behind him, he could hear the creature crashing through the underbrush in pursuit, moving with a speed that seemed impossible for something so large. The logging road offered easier footing, but it also made Brian an easy target. He plunged into the thick woods, hoping the dense vegetation would slow his pursuer. Thorns ripped through his pants, drawing blood from his legs, but he felt no pain. Adrenaline had taken complete control of his nervous system. A tree exploded behind him, splinters of wood whistling past his head like shrapnel. Brian risked a glance back and saw the creature systematically destroying every obstacle in its path. Saplings bent and snapped, larger trees groaned and toppled. Nothing in the forest could stand against the thing's raw physical power. Brian's lungs burned as he fought his way through a particularly dense thicket of mountain laurel. The elevation was working against him, each step becoming more difficult as his body screamed for oxygen. But terror drove him forward when his muscles wanted to quit. He burst from the thicket and found himself on a narrow deer trail that paralleled a creek bed. The water rushed over moss-covered rocks about 20 feet below, cutting a deep channel through the limestone bedrock. Brian knew this creek. It eventually joined the Buchanan River about 2 miles downstream. The sounds of pursuit had fallen behind, but Brian didn't slow his pace. He followed the deer trail as it wound along the ridge above the creek, praying that the creature had lost his scent or simply given up the chase. But his hope died when he heard the sound that would haunt his nightmares for the rest of his life. The bone-deep crack of something large breaking in half, followed by a wet, tearing sound that could only be meat and tissue separating. Brian knew with sick certainty what was happening back at his kill site. The creature had returned to claim his deer, and from the sounds echoing through the forest, it was literally tearing the animal apart. Another crack, louder this time, then another. The creature was systematically breaking every bone in the deer's body, probably preparatory to feeding. Brian had seen what bears and coyotes did to carcasses, but this sounded completely different, more deliberate, more violent. Brian forced himself to keep moving, following the deer trail as it descended toward the creek. He needed to put as much distance as possible between himself and that thing before it finished with the deer and decided to resume its pursuit. The trail was treacherous, carved into the steep hillside by decades of deer hooves. Loose rocks shifted under Brian's boots, threatening to send him tumbling into the creek below. But he maintained his pace, driven by the memory of those reflective eyes and the casual display of inhuman strength. As Brian rounded a bend in the trail, he heard something that made his blood freeze. The bone-cracking sounds had stopped, replaced by a new noise that was infinitely worse. Heavy footsteps, moving fast, coming in his direction. The creature was following his trail. Brian's mind raced through his options, none of them good. He could try to hide, but the thing had demonstrated an uncanny ability to track him. He could try to fight, but his rifle would be useless against something that could crush truck batteries with its bare hands. His only hope was to reach the main road before the creature caught up with him. But as Brian increased his pace along the narrow deer trail, his boot came down on a patch of loose shale. The rock shifted under his weight, and suddenly Brian was sliding down the steep hillside toward the creek below, completely out of control. He crashed through a small pine tree, the branches tearing at his jacket and face. A larger oak blocked his path, and Brian slammed into it with his left shoulder, the impact knocking the wind from his lungs and sending lightning bolts of pain down his arm. Brian lay gasping at the base of the oak, his rifle lost somewhere in the tangle of vegetation above him. His left shoulder throbbed with each heartbeat, probably dislocated or broken. Blood ran from numerous cuts on his face and hands, but he was alive, and for the moment, hidden. The thick canopy of rhododendron and mountain laurel provided excellent cover from above. If he remained perfectly still, the creature might pass by without detecting him. Brian controlled his breathing, trying to minimize any sound that might give away his position. His shoulder screamed in protest with each movement, but he forced himself to remain motionless. Above him, on the deer trail, he could hear heavy footsteps approaching. The creature paused directly above his hiding place. Brian could hear it breathing, that same deep rhythmic sound he'd noticed earlier. But now, there was something else mixed with the breathing. A low, rumbling noise, almost like a large dog growling. Leaves and small debris began raining down as the creature apparently searched the area where Brian had lost his footing. It was looking for him, systematically checking every possible hiding place. Those reflective eyes would be scanning every shadow, every potential concealment. Brian pressed himself against the base of the oak tree, trying to become invisible. His shoulder had gone numb, which he knew was a bad sign. Blood continued to seep from the cuts on his face, and he was terrified that the creature would smell it. The footsteps moved away from his position, continuing down the trail. Brian allowed himself to breathe normally, hope beginning to build in his chest. Maybe the thing had lost his scent. Maybe he could remain hidden until it moved far enough away for him to make his escape. But his hope evaporated when he heard the footsteps returning. The creature was backtracking, re-examining the area where it had lost his trail. This time, the search sounded more systematic, more thorough. A massive tree branch crashed to the ground just 20 feet from Brian's hiding place. Then another. The creature was apparently using brute force to clear away any vegetation that might conceal its prey. In a few minutes, it would work its way down to Brian's position. Desperation drove Brian to move despite his injured shoulder. He began crawling through the thick undergrowth, trying to put distance between himself and the methodical destruction taking place above him. Every movement sent waves of agony through his left side, but terror provided motivation stronger than pain. Brian worked his way downhill toward the creek, hoping the running water would mask any sounds he might make. The rhododendron thicket was almost impenetrable, forcing him to crawl on his belly like a wounded animal. Thorns tore at his clothing and skin, but he didn't dare make any noise. Behind him, the destruction continued. Trees cracked and fell with thunderous crashes that echoed through the hollow. The creature was clearing the entire hillside, eliminating every possible hiding place. Its methodical approach suggested intelligence far beyond any animal Brian had ever encountered. Brian reached the edge of the creek and rolled into the shallow water with a splash he was sure the creature had heard. The October water was shockingly cold, numbing his injured shoulder within seconds. But the creek bed offered the only escape route available to him. The water was only knee-deep, but moved swiftly over the rocky bottom. Brian began working his way downstream, using rocks and fallen logs for support. His boots slipped constantly on the algae-covered stones, and twice he fell completely into the frigid water. Above him, on the hillside he'd just abandoned, Brian heard a sound that made his stomach clench. A long, mournful howl that seemed to express frustration and rage in equal measure. The creature had discovered his escape route. Brian moved faster through the creek, no longer caring about the noise he made. Speed was more important than stealth now. The creature would follow the creek bed, and Brian's only hope was to reach the main road before it caught up with him. But the creek seemed to wind endlessly through the mountains, meandering around every ridge and outcropping. What had looked like a direct route to safety on Brian's mental map was proving to be a maze of bends and obstacles. His injured shoulder had gone completely numb, and Brian realized he was probably going into shock. The combination of trauma, blood loss, and hypothermia was taking its toll on his body. He forced himself to keep moving, but his pace was slowing with each step. That's when he heard the splashing behind him. Brian turned and saw the creature standing in the creek about 200 yards upstream. In the filtered sunlight of the creek bed, he got his clearest look yet at the thing that was hunting him. It stood nearly 9 feet tall, covered in dark brown fur that glistened with moisture. Its arms were disproportionately long, hanging almost to its knees, ending in hands that looked powerful enough to tear a man in half. But it was the creature's face that nearly paralyzed Brian with terror, almost human, but wrong in every detail. The skull was elongated, the jaw too prominent, the eyes too small, and set too deep. When it opened its mouth, Brian saw teeth that belonged on a predator designed to rip flesh from bone. The creature had been toying with him. It could have caught him at any point during the chase, but instead it had herded him into this creek bed, where there was nowhere left to run. Now it began moving downstream with deliberate slowness, like a cat stalking a wounded mouse. Brian turned and ran through the water with desperate abandon. His numb shoulder threw off his balance, causing him to stumble and fall repeatedly. The rocky creek bed tore through his clothes and skin, but he felt no pain. All his remaining energy focused on the simple goal of staying ahead of the thing that was methodically closing the distance between them. The creek began to narrow as it cut deeper into the limestone bedrock. Vertical walls rose on both sides, creating a natural canyon that offered no escape routes. Brian realized with growing horror that he was trapped in a stone corridor with a monster at his back. But ahead, around the next bend, Brian could see where the creek emerged from the canyon into a broader valley. If he could reach that opening, he might find a way to climb out of the creek bed and make a final run for the road. Brian summoned his last reserves of strength and sprinted through the knee-deep water. Behind him, the splashing sounds were getting closer. The creature was no longer content to stalk its prey. It was coming for him with the inexorable determination of a force of nature. Brian rounded the final bend and saw salvation ahead. The creek flowed under a concrete bridge that carried Route 33 across the narrow valley. Cars occasionally passed overhead, their tires humming on the asphalt. Civilization was literally within reach. But as Brian staggered toward the bridge, his legs finally gave out. He collapsed into the shallow water, his body unable to take another step. The combination of injuries, exhaustion, and hypothermia had pushed him beyond his physical limits. Brian crawled the final 50 yards to the bridge, using his one good arm to pull himself through the water. Above him, he could hear the rumble of traffic, people going about their normal lives, completely unaware of the nightmare unfolding in the creek below. Brian reached the concrete support pillar and used it to pull himself upright. A set of maintenance steps built into the pillar led up to the roadway. If he could climb those steps, he could flag down a passing motorist and escape this nightmare. But as Brian placed his foot on the first step, a massive hand closed around his ankle. The creature had caught him. Brian looked down and saw those reflective eyes staring up at him from the water. The thing's face showed no emotion, no anger, no malice, just the cold indifference of a predator that had finally cornered its prey. Brian tried to scream, but only a strangled whimper emerged from his throat. The creature's grip was like a steel trap, completely immobilizing his leg. With effortless strength, it began pulling Brian back down toward the water. Desperation gave Brian one final burst of energy. He grabbed the maintenance ladder with his good hand and held on with every ounce of strength remaining in his body. For a moment, he was suspended between the creature's inhuman grip and his desperate hold on the ladder. Then, something wonderful happened. A loaded logging truck rumbled across the bridge overhead, its diesel engine roaring and its air brakes hissing. The sound was so loud, so aggressively mechanical, that it seemed to startle the creature. Its grip on Brian's ankle loosened just enough for him to tear free. Brian scrambled up the maintenance ladder like a man possessed, ignoring the agony in his injured shoulder. Behind him, he heard that mournful howl again, but this time it sounded almost mournful, almost sad. Brian reached the roadway and collapsed on the asphalt, gasping for breath. A pickup truck approached from the south, and Brian waved frantically with his good arm. The truck slowed, pulled over, and a middle-aged man in a baseball cap climbed out. "Jesus, buddy, what happened to you?" the man asked, taking in Brian's torn clothes, bloody face, and obvious injuries. "There's something in the woods," Brian gasped. "Something that shouldn't exist. It chased me. It nearly killed me." The man helped Brian to his feet and guided him toward the pickup truck. "You look like you tangled with a bear, son. We need to get you to a hospital." Brian wanted to explain that it hadn't been a bear, that it had been something far worse. But as he looked back toward the creek bed, he saw nothing but water and shadows. The creature had vanished as completely as if it had never existed. The drive to the regional medical center in Elkins passed in a blur of pain medication and confused questions from paramedics. Brian tried to explain what had happened, but even to his own ears, the story sounded like the ravings of a man suffering from severe trauma and blood loss. Dr. Sarah Martinez, the emergency room physician who treated Brian's injuries, was professional but clearly skeptical of his account. His left shoulder was dislocated, not broken, and she was able to reset it with a combination of muscle relaxants and careful manipulation. The numerous cuts and abrasions required stitches, but none were life-threatening. "Mr. Cooper," Dr. Martinez said as she finished bandaging the deepest cut on his forehead, "you've suffered significant trauma, both physical and psychological. It's not uncommon for patients in your condition to experience hallucinations or false memories. The mind sometimes creates elaborate explanations for events it can't process normally." "I know what I saw," Brian insisted, though his voice lacked conviction. The warm hospital room, with its bright lights and medical equipment, made his story seem increasingly unreal. "Something attacked me in those mountains. Something that walked on two legs and stood 9 feet tall." Dr. Martinez made a note on his chart. "I'm going to prescribe some medication to help with the pain and anxiety. I'd also like to refer you to a colleague who specializes in trauma counseling. What you experienced was clearly terrifying, regardless of what actually happened." State Trooper James Fletcher arrived while Brian was being discharged. Fletcher was a 20-year veteran of law enforcement in West Virginia, and his expression suggested he'd heard every possible explanation for unusual incidents in the mountains. "Tell me about this creature you encountered, Mr. Cooper," Fletcher said, pulling out a small notebook. Brian repeated his story, watching the trooper's expression grow more skeptical with each detail. When he described the creature lifting his truck and crushing his battery, Fletcher stopped taking notes entirely. "Mr. Cooper, I've been working these mountains for 2 decades, Fletcher said patiently. I've investigated bear attacks, mountain lion sightings, and every other kind of wildlife encounter you can imagine. What you're describing doesn't match the behavior patterns of any animal native to West Virginia. I know how it sounds, Brian said, but my truck is still up there on that logging road. You can see where it was damaged. Fletcher made another note. We'll send someone to recover your vehicle and any personal property. But I have to ask, have you been drinking today? Any recreational drug use? Prescription medications that might affect your judgment? Brian's blood test had already come back clean, but he could see that Fletcher had already made up his mind about what had really happened. To the trooper, Brian was just another city hunter who'd gotten spooked by a bear and let his imagination run wild. There's something else, Brian said, remembering the footprint he'd found near his deer kill. I found tracks near where I shot the deer. Footprints unlike anything I've ever seen. They might still be there. Fletcher's expression suggested he doubted that as well, but he dutifully wrote down the location where Brian claimed to have found the prints. Brian was released from the hospital that evening with a prescription for pain medication and strict instructions to follow up with his regular physician within 48 hours. A friend from Charleston drove up to collect him, bringing clothes to replace those that had been cut away by the medical staff. 3 days later, Fletcher called to report that they'd found Brian's truck exactly where he'd said it would be. The battery was missing, and there was significant damage to the interior, particularly around the dashboard and steering column. But the trooper attributed this to vandalism, possibly by the same people who'd stolen the battery. We didn't find any unusual tracks, Fletcher reported, but there'd been significant rain since your incident. Any footprints would have been washed away by now. What about my deer? Brian asked. Did you find the carcass? There was a long pause before Fletcher answered. We found remains scattered over a wide area. Looked like scavengers had been at it pretty thoroughly. Bears, coyotes, maybe some feral dogs. Pretty typical for what happens to gut piles left in the woods. But Brian could hear something in the trooper's voice that suggested Fletcher had been disturbed by what he'd found at the kill site, something that didn't match his official explanation. Trooper Fletcher, Brian pressed, was there anything unusual about how the deer had been processed? Another pause. Mr. Cooper, I've seen what bears do to carcasses. I've seen what happens when packs of wild dogs get to a deer. What we found up there was more extensive than usual, but there's always a logical explanation for these things. Fletcher's tone suggested the conversation was over, but Brian sensed that the veteran law enforcement officer had seen something that challenged his own assumptions about what was possible in those mountains. Brian never returned to his grandfather's cabin. He sold the property to a timber company and moved to Richmond, where he took a job with the Virginia Department of Transportation. He told himself he was ready for a change, ready to leave the mountains behind and start fresh in the city. But late at night, when the sounds of urban traffic couldn't quite drown out his memories, Brian would find himself thinking about those reflective eyes and the casual display of inhuman strength. He would remember the sound of bones cracking and the methodical way the creature had stalked him through the forest. 6 months after the incident, Brian's sleep was still haunted by nightmares. The prescribed medication helped with the anxiety during the day, but nothing could stop the dreams that came when he closed his eyes. In those dreams, he was always back in the creek bed, always feeling that massive hand close around his ankle, always hearing that mournful howl echoing through the mountains. Dr. Patricia Hensley, the trauma counselor doctor, Martinez had suggested that Brian's experience was a classic case of acute stress reaction combined with isolation-induced paranoia. The human mind, she explained, was remarkably creative when it came to generating explanations for events that challenged its understanding of reality. You experienced a genuine survival situation, Doctor, Hensley told him during one of their sessions. Your truck broke down in an isolated area, you were injured during your attempt to hike out, and your mind created an elaborate threat narrative to explain the psychological stress you were experiencing. But the physical evidence, Brian protested, the damage to my truck, the way my deer was torn apart. Vandalism explains the truck damage, Doctor, Hensley replied patiently. And you said yourself that State Trooper Fletcher found evidence of scavenger activity at your hunting site. Sometimes the simplest explanation is the correct one. Brian wanted to believe her. It would have been so much easier to accept that his mind had simply cracked under stress, that the creature existed only in his traumatized imagination. But every time he closed his eyes, he could see those reflective pupils staring at him from the creek bed. Every time he relaxed his guard, he could smell that musky odor that had made his stomach churn. 3 weeks before the first anniversary of his encounter, Brian received a phone call that changed everything. Mr. Cooper, this is Ranger David Chen with the Monongahela National Forest Service. I understand you had an incident in our area last October that involved some kind of wildlife encounter. Brian's throat went dry. Yes, but I'm not sure what you mean by incident. I filed a report with the state police. Mr. Cooper, I'm calling because we've had several similar reports in the past few months. Hunters and hikers who've encountered something in the mountains that doesn't match any known wildlife patterns. I was wondering if you'd be willing to discuss your experience in more detail. Brian felt his hands begin to shake. Similar reports? 3 separate incidents since January, Ranger Chen confirmed, all in the same general area where you had your encounter, all involving descriptions of bipedal creatures displaying unusual behavior patterns. I'd rather not discuss the details over the phone, but I think you might find these reports relevant. They arranged to meet at a restaurant in Elkins the following Saturday. Brian almost cancelled the meeting twice, terrified of reopening psychological wounds that were just beginning to heal. But the knowledge that other people had reported similar encounters was impossible to ignore. Ranger Chen turned out to be a soft-spoken man in his 40s, with the weathered appearance of someone who'd spent his career in the outdoors. He brought a manila folder containing incident reports that he spread across their table once they'd ordered coffee. I want to stress that these reports are not part of any official investigation, Chen began. The Forest Service doesn't have protocols for dealing with unusual wildlife encounters, but unofficially, some of us have been tracking patterns that don't fit conventional explanations. Brian studied the first report, dated January 15th. A family from Ohio had been camping near the Gordinier Scenic Area when something had systematically destroyed their campsite during the night. The damage included a torn tent, scattered equipment, and what the family described as massive footprints around their vehicle. They reported smelling something terrible, Chen said, watching Brian's reaction. Described it as like a zoo, but worse, and they claimed something was watching them from the trees all night, something large enough to shake the branches when it moved. The second report described an encounter by 2 college students who'd been hiking the Highland Scenic Highway in March. They'd heard what they described as conversation coming from the woods near their trail, deep, guttural sounds that seemed to be some form of communication between multiple individuals. When they investigated, they found an area where several large trees had been broken off about 8 feet from the ground, Chen continued. No storm damage, no machinery marks. Just clean breaks that suggested incredible physical strength. The third report was the most disturbing. A bow hunter from Pennsylvania had been tracking a wounded bear in early September when he'd encountered what he described as a family group of large bipedal creatures. According to his account, the creatures had killed and were feeding on the wounded bear when he stumbled into their feeding area. The hunter managed to take several photographs before the creatures became aware of his presence, Chen said, pulling out a folder of printed digital images. The photos are blurry and taken from a distance, but they show something that's difficult to explain conventionally. Brian studied the photographs with trembling hands. The images were indeed blurry and shot from far away, but they clearly showed large, dark shapes clustered around what appeared to be a bear carcass. The shapes were roughly humanoid, but far too large to be human. In one photograph, a creature appeared to be looking directly at the camera, its eyes reflecting the camera's flash like those of a nocturnal animal. "What happened to the hunter?" Brian asked. "He claims the creatures chased him back to his vehicle," Chen replied. "Said they threw rocks at him and made sounds he'd never heard from any animal. When he returned with other hunters the next day, they found evidence of the bear kill, but no signs of whatever had been feeding on it." Brian set the photographs down with hands that wouldn't stop shaking. "Why are you showing me this? What do you want from me?" Chen leaned forward, his expression serious. "Mr. Cooper, I've been working these mountains for 18 years. I've investigated every kind of wildlife incident you can imagine, but in the past year, we've had more unexplained encounters than in the previous decade combined. Something is happening in these mountains, and I don't think we can continue to dismiss every report as misidentification or trauma-induced hallucination." "What kind of something?" "I don't know," Chen admitted. "But whatever it is, it's becoming more active, more aggressive. The encounters are happening more frequently and closer to populated areas. I'm worried that someone is going to get seriously hurt." Brian thought about his own experience, about the methodical way the creature had stalked him and the casual display of strength when it lifted his truck. If that thing had wanted to hurt him, nothing could have stopped it. "What are you asking me to do?" Brian said. "I'm putting together an unofficial database of these encounters," Chen explained. "Detailed accounts from credible witnesses, physical evidence when available, patterns of behavior that might help us understand what we're dealing with. Your incident was one of the most comprehensive encounters we have on record." Brian felt the old terror creeping back into his chest. "I moved away from the mountains for a reason, Ranger Chen. I don't want to relive that experience." "I understand," Chen said sympathetically. "But if these creatures are becoming more active, more aggressive, then people need to know what they might encounter up there. Your testimony could save lives." That night, Brian lay awake, staring at the ceiling of his Richmond apartment, thinking about the photographs Chen had shown him. Those reflective eyes in the blurry image looked exactly like the ones that had stared at him from the creek bed. The same intelligence, the same predatory calculation. For 11 months, Brian had convinced himself that his experience had been a stress-induced breakdown, a psychological reaction to being lost and injured in the wilderness. Dr. Hensley's explanations had provided a rational framework for understanding what had happened to him. But the existence of other witnesses, other encounters, other photographs suggested that something real was happening in those mountains. Something that challenged every assumption about what kind of wildlife existed in the forests of West Virginia. 3 days later, Brian called Ranger Chen and agreed to provide a detailed written account of his encounter. The process of writing down every detail, every sensation, every moment of terror was like living through the experience all over again. But Chen had been right about one thing. People needed to know what was out there. Brian's written account eventually became part of an unofficial database maintained by a small group of Forest Service employees, state wildlife officials, and academic researchers. The database contained more than 40 similar encounters spanning 3 decades, all from the same general region of the Appalachian Mountains. But the database remained unofficial, and the encounters remained unexplained. Government agencies had no protocols for dealing with creatures that shouldn't exist according to conventional zoology. Academic researchers who expressed interest in investigating the reports quickly found their funding cut and their professional reputations questioned. Brian never returned to the mountains, but he followed the news from West Virginia with growing unease. Hiking accidents were increasing. Hunters were reporting equipment failures and vehicle problems in the same areas where creatures had been sighted. The State Tourism Board began quietly discouraging overnight camping in certain remote areas of the national forest. 2 years after his encounter, Brian received a phone call from Dr. Jeffrey Morrison, an anthropologist from West Virginia University, who had been quietly investigating the creature sightings for his own research. "Mr. Cooper, I've read your account of your 2023 encounter, and I was wondering if you'd be willing to discuss some additional details with me," Dr. Morrison said. "What kind of details?" "Behavioral observations, primarily. Your account contains some of the most detailed descriptions of creature behavior that we have on record. The way you describe the creature's stalking patterns, its apparent intelligence, its territorial displays. These are unlike anything in the conventional wildlife literature." Brian found himself agreeing to meet with Dr. Morrison, despite his better judgment. The anthropologist turned out to be a serious academic who approached the subject with scientific skepticism rather than sensationalism. "The creature you encountered displayed what we call complex behavioral adaptations," Dr. Morrison explained during their meeting. "Tool use, territorial marking, tactical hunting strategies. These behaviors suggest intelligence far beyond any known primate species." "You're saying it's some kind of undiscovered ape?" "I'm saying the evidence points toward the existence of a large bipedal primate that has successfully avoided scientific documentation for decades," Dr. Morrison replied carefully. "The fossil record shows that such creatures existed in North America as recently as 10,000 years ago. It's not impossible that a relict population could have survived in remote mountain regions." Brian thought about the creature's massive size, its casual strength, the intelligence in those reflective eyes. If these things exist, why haven't they been officially discovered? Why isn't there better evidence? Dr. Morrison smiled grimly. "Mr. Cooper, there are regions of the Appalachian Mountains that have never been thoroughly explored by modern science. Thousands of square miles of wilderness where a small population of large primates could exist without human contact. Add to that the fact that any scientist who seriously investigates these reports risks professional ridicule, and you begin to understand why the evidence remains anecdotal." "But the government must know something," Brian pressed. "Ranger Chen said there have been dozens of reports." "The government knows that people are reporting encounters with unidentified creatures," Dr. Morrison corrected. "But knowledge and acknowledgement are very different things. No federal agency wants to be responsible for confirming the existence of something that would fundamentally challenge our understanding of North American wildlife." 3 months later, Brian read a news story that made his blood run cold. A family of hikers had disappeared while camping in the Dolly Sods Wilderness area, less than 50 miles from where Brian had his encounter. Their campsite was found destroyed, their vehicle undamaged but apparently abandoned. The official investigation concluded that the family had become disoriented and lost while hiking, probably falling victim to exposure or accident in the rugged terrain. But unofficial reports suggested that their campsite showed signs of systematic destruction that couldn't be explained by weather or conventional wildlife. Brian knew with sick certainty what had really happened to that family. They had encountered something in those mountains that was stronger, faster, and more intelligent than any human, something that viewed human intrusion into its territory as a threat to be eliminated. He tried calling Ranger Chen to share his concerns, but learned that Chen had been transferred to a position in Utah, far from the mountains where the encounters were occurring. Dr. Morrison's university research had been terminated due to budget constraints, and the anthropologist had taken a position with a private research foundation in Oregon. The unofficial database of creature encounters was quietly discontinued, its files transferred to an undisclosed federal archive where they would never be seen by the public. But the encounters continued. Brian began monitoring news reports from West Virginia obsessively, looking for stories that might indicate creature activity. Hiking accidents, hunting mishaps, unexplained equipment failures, all in the same remote regions where credible witnesses had reported sightings. The pattern was clear to anyone willing to see it. Something was living in those mountains, something that was becoming increasingly aggressive toward human intrusion. But the truth would never be officially acknowledged because it was too disturbing, too challenging to conventional beliefs about the natural world. 5 years after his encounter, Brian still lived in Richmond, still worked his government job, still took medication for anxiety and insomnia. But late at night, when the city sounds couldn't quite drown out his memories, he would find himself thinking about those mountains and what was hidden in their shadows. Sometimes he wondered if he should try to warn people more directly, should find a way to make his story public, despite the official skepticism and professional ridicule it would bring. But he knew that no one would believe him, just as he wouldn't have believed anyone else who told such a story. The truth was too strange, too frightening, too contrary to everything people wanted to believe about the world they lived in. So Brian kept his silence and continued monitoring the news from West Virginia, watching for signs that others had encountered what he had encountered in those mountains. He read between the lines of official reports, looked for patterns in seemingly unrelated incidents, and waited for the day when the truth would become too obvious to deny. That day might be coming sooner than anyone expected. The encounters were increasing in frequency, occurring closer to populated areas, involving more witnesses who couldn't be easily dismissed or intimidated into silence. Sooner or later, someone would obtain clear photographic evidence, or multiple credible witnesses would come forward simultaneously, or an encounter would occur in a location where official denial was impossible. When that day arrived, Brian Cooper would be vindicated. But he took no satisfaction in that prospect because he knew what vindication would mean. It would mean that the thing he had encountered in those West Virginia mountains was real, was breeding, was expanding its territory. It would mean that nowhere was truly safe from creatures that could crush truck batteries with their bare hands and hunt humans with the patience and intelligence of apex predators. And it would mean that Brian's nightmare had been shared by others, would be shared by others until someone found a way to deal with threats that officially didn't exist, but unofficially were becoming impossible to ignore. The sound of bones cracking still echoed in Brian's dreams, reminding him that some kinds of truth were too terrible to acknowledge, even when the evidence was literally staring you in the face with eyes that reflected light, like those of something that had never been human, never would be human, but was undeniably, terrifyingly real. Brian Cooper had survived his encounter with that reality, but he had never truly escaped it. And he never would. Because once you knew what was really living in those mountains, once you understood that the wilderness was not empty, but inhabited by things that viewed humans as intruders in their ancient domain, you could never again feel safe in the deep woods where civilization's light didn't reach. The creature was still out there, still hunting, still defending its territory with the casual violence of something that had never learned to fear humans. And Brian knew, with absolute certainty, that he was not the last person who would discover this truth the hard way. The mountains kept their secrets, but not forever. Eventually, the truth would emerge from those shadows, and when it did, the world would be forced to acknowledge that wilderness areas contained more than trees and conventional wildlife. They contained things that shouldn't exist but did, things that remembered when humans were not the dominant predators on this continent, things that had never accepted the changes that civilization had brought to their ancient hunting grounds. Brian Cooper had looked into the eyes of one such creature and lived to tell about it. But his survival had come at the cost of ever feeling truly safe again, because he knew what was watching from the trees when people ventured too far into places where only the strong survived and the weak became prey. The sound of bones cracking would haunt his dreams forever, a reminder that some encounters change you in ways that never heal. Ways that leave you forever marked as someone who has seen too much truth about what really lives in the dark places where civilized people fear to go.